Calling this talk the true,
Just hidden history.
the hidden history. Okay. Test. Oh. I want to record this. Okay, thank you for coming here to our final presentation of the whole amazing weekend here at Contact. Yes, and the guy who's going to put it all together, because we've heard so many things, really. There was everything you can imagine, but I think Jim's presentations gives you a overall perspective about, well, why we aren't hearing the truth, what's really going on, and what we can do about it. So let's give Jim Mars a big hand. Yeah. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Howard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, is my mic on? We doing? Everybody here okay? Hello? I may have to use the handheld one. Okay, yeah, that's working. Okay, well, we got a long way to go, and I'm going to try to cover a bunch of stuff, and I'm going to kind of whiz through some of this earlier stuff. I hope you all have caught some of my other presentations. Good, because some of this is somewhat the same. Oops, there we go. Oops, wait a minute. All right, we're going to talk about hidden history, the secrets that connect the Bible, the Knights Templars, the Freemasons, Trilateral Commission, and 9/11. Whoa, don't know this. Okay. All right. Well, now we're going. All right. Let's go back to Atlantis, famous Atlantis, fabled Atlantis. What was it? Where was it? I think if you've attended my first two lectures, you realize that the evidence for a highly technological civilization on this planet before our written history is quite compelling, almost overwhelming. And it's been written about by the esoteric writers such as Manly P. Hall, who talks about how that early on the gods were here and that they chose the wisest of their the humans and gave them their great knowledge. And so, it's not just Zachariah Sitchin, it's not just the story of the Anunnaki that we're dealing with, although all roads do lead to Sumar. I know when I was growing up, and probably for most of you folks, we were always taught that ancient Egypt was the world's first great civilization, and I was somewhat nonplussed to find that quite the contrary. Ancient Egypt, with all its finery, was just a degraded version of the Sumerian civilization. And again, we have to go back to the earliest civilizations, and then you find that everything degraded. The Egyptian dynasties, the earliest ones, they had the best jewelry, the best architecture. They had the knowledge, and then it degenerated from there. They knew about the planets. In this stele, we find all the planets are listed and their proper proportion, and yet Neptune was not found until 1846, and Pluto, they didn't know about Pluto until 1930, and yet the Sumerians, all those many thousands of years ago, had them correctly positioned in the solar system. And we know more about the ancient Sumerians than we'll ever know about the ancient Egyptians or Romans, because the Sumerians wrote all of their documents down on clay tablets with a stylus creating cuneiform writing, and then baked them. And there's like 500,000 of them still existing, and they're scattered all throughout museums around the world, but mostly buried in the basement. And only about 20% of them have been translated. And then now we get into people like Zachariah Sitchin who are translating them, but it's not just him. There's a R.A. Boulay, there's a C.L. Turnage, my friend Michael Tellinger. I could go on. There's a whole list of people. The only real criticism of Sitchin, if you really stop and look at it, is not so much his translations. The translations are all pretty much the same. The difference is his interpretation, okay? And yet when you hear his interpretation and then line that up with the ancient astronaut theory that was kick-started by von Däniken all those years ago, it all begins to make more and more sense. In these tablets, on more than one occasion, they tell of the origin of human beings. And they say 432,000 years ago, the Anunnaki came. And that they came through the Great Belt, which is probably the asteroid belt. And then they landed crashed down in the Persian Gulf, just like our early astronauts crashed down in the ocean. And they began to colonize, and they were here apparently after gold. Now, we all know gold is worth a lot, but apparently they had another reason for it, and that was to try to repair damage to their home world's atmosphere. Now, if that sounds silly to you, you might consider that Edward Teller, the grandfather of the hydrogen bomb, his solution for ozone holes was to put particles of gold or other heavy metals in the upper atmosphere to reflect ultraviolet rays and hold down what's come to be known as global warming. You don't hear about global warming much anymore because too much politics going on there. But now they call it climate change, yeah. But the Anunnaki, here are these astronauts, and they're on another world, and they started basically first trying to extract gold out of the Persian Gulf. That's a slow, laborious, and inefficient process. So before long, they found they could do better by mining, so they went to South America and South Africa, and where there are still hundreds, perhaps thousands of ancient gold mines. And they started doing that, but then this created problems because, these guys said, hey, we signed up to be astronauts. We didn't sign up to be miners, and this is tough work. And so there's some arguments, some strikes, and as you can imagine, just like what happened right here, if you know anything about our labor movement and the Ludlow massacre and all like that, there's a lot of them, the Anunnaki leaders said, okay, well, just shoot them, or put them in prison or whatever, but others said, no, surely we can reach some kind of accommodation. And so their science officer, Inky, says, well, I've been working with these earth primitives there in my laboratory in the Abzug, which they determine is Africa. He says, I think that we could tweak their DNA a little bit and produce a worker race that could do the job for us, let them do all the heavy work. And interestingly enough, even in the Sumerian tablets, they have the same ethical arguments that we're having today about maybe it's not proper to clone people and to mess with DNA and all like that. But, and as they themselves said, it's not up to us to play God. But Inky finally convinced him. He says, look, we're not playing God. We're not creating anything. We're just improving the breed. Oops, well, wait a minute. That's what we do with horses and cows and dogs and cats, except instead of improving the breed through selective breeding, they did it with DNA manipulation. And that's really quite interesting. They even explained exactly how they did this by creating this first hybrid. They took the sperm of an Anunnaki male, and then they impregnated the ovum of an Anunnaki female who carried it to term, and then they had to perform a cesarean section, and the Earthman was born that they call the Adam, or the Adama, interestingly enough. And that's this thing of the DNA, their obvious knowledge and manipulation of DNA really got me going, because I kept thinking back to Bible school and the story of Noah and the Ark, which they just made a big motion picture out of with Russell Crowe, and I'm sure it's got lots of great special effects, but we still in all, we get this picture of thousands of animals crawling on this boat, okay? Well, I always had a problem with that. You telling me the lions lay down next to the gazelles, besides that, they're all going to go to the bathroom. How do you handle that, you know? I might have figured that one out. I hear that on boats there's a poop deck. But then when I learn about their knowledge and manipulation of DNA, then you also realize that the Sumerian tablets carry a story of the Great Flood. And in their version, there's also a person who is told by his God that they're going to try to wipe out the humans, and that he better build a boat, and it tells him how to make it, tells him how to seal it with pitch and bitumen. But there's only two differences between the version of the Sumerians and the version in the Bible. And one is the name. In the Bible, we know him as Noah. In the Sumerian version, there's a couple of names, but Utnapishtim is one of them. But that's just the name changes because of the language. But the one that really got me was, in the Bible it says he took two of every living thing, and in the Sumerian account it says he took the seed of every living thing. Oh, wait a minute. Now, instead of a boatload of animals, you've got a closet on the boat with DNA tissue in it. And you use that to repopulate the world. Makes a little more sense. We know about the Baghdad battery. We know that they had the ability to create electricity. And this is pretty primitive. What I'm sure some of you have already heard discussed in some of the programs on this, at this meetings out here, is the power generation by drawing power from the earth, drawing power from ley lines, drawing power from just from the air, 0-point gravity. So there's a lot of ways of determining and getting energy, and apparently they had access to some of this. I'm convinced the Great Pyramid, it was a power generator. Because in Egypt, everywhere I went, there's hieroglyphics except in the Great Pyramid. And there are niches and places, obviously, for equipment in the Great Pyramid, but we no longer have access to that. You can thank Napoleon for that, and other fine Christian armies who said, "What's that? We don't know. It's got to be of the devil." And they took it all out and burned it and threw it all away. So all we're left with is the monument. We also can see that the ancient Egyptians, that some of this hand-me-down knowledge from the Sumerians, they were still possessing it because they had what they call the Jed pillar. And you can see here the Jed pillars are connected by a wire to these globe-looking things. And we're not sure how all that worked, but it worked. They also had knowledge of the white powder, the mafus, or manna. And the Egyptian pharaohs, this was a great part of their ceremony. In the Book of the Dead, on their way to the afterlife, they would stop at each stage and say, "What is it?" And all of this knowledge from Sumeria ended up being transferred to Egypt, which just suddenly sprang full bore into a full-blown civilization. How did they do that? Well, pretty obvious, through the biblical patriarch Abraham. Now, if you go back and study your Bible, you'll find that it didn't say Abraham the Jew or Abraham the Egyptian or Palestinian. It says he came from Ur of Chaldea. Well, Ur is one of the principal cities, and my little pointer's not working. It is. I can't see it. Anyway, down there at the bottom, near the Persian Gulf, you can see Ur, and it was named. And then the other Sumerian cities, Uruk and Iraq, and these were named after Abraham's relatives. So Abraham was not Jewish. He was not a desert, nomad. He was a very well-to-do, well-positioned Sumerian. And he travels and goes to Egypt, and pretty quickly all that knowledge has been passed, and the whole Egyptian civilization comes into being. Now, this knowledge then resided in the Egyptian mystery school. And one of the people who undoubtedly was well-schooled in the Egyptian mystery school was Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III. Now, Amenhotep III was kind of a badass, and he's the one who decided he didn't want someone pretending to be a successor to his throne, so he ordered that if any of his wives were to have a male offspring, they were to be put to death. Now, this makes a whole lot more sense than trying to kill every male child of all your slaves, right? This was about royal ascension. And sure enough, one of his wives gave birth to a male, and they, like any mother would do, she wants to preserve him, so they put him in a basket, and they floated him down the Nile and down to the home of their slaves, who were the Hebrews. And the Hebrews raised him, all right? And that's why that when he finally got old enough and Amenhotep III died and he ascended to the throne and became Pharaoh, he changed his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, the worshiper of the one true God. And how did he get on all that? Well, because he was raised by the Hebrews, who were already worshiping the monolithic God. Okay, so now he started shutting down all of the temples and all the various worshipings of the Egyptian, ancient Egyptian gods, and you can imagine how that set with the priesthood. They didn't like that, but he was a pharaoh, which means he's supposed to be of the gods, so they can't kill him, but what they can do is run him off, okay, and they can banish him. So they said, you're going to have to leave. And they said, take your family with you. Well, he didn't take his birth family, he took the family that raised him, the Hebrews. And they took their relatives, and they told him, take whatever you want, okay? Well, of course, what they meant was take all your belongings and, sheep, goats, whatever you have. But they took that as a license to steal, and so they grabbed everything. They grabbed everything they could get their hands on, and they took off. And then, the familiar story of how the Pharaoh's army chases after them, and they got into the Sea of Reeds down near the Red Sea. And then we get various stories. Sometimes they say that war chariots of the Pharaohs bogged down in the marshy area, and they couldn't follow them. And of course, then we get the story of the seas opening up. And anyway, they got away. So it turns out that Moses is not really a name, it's a title. And Moses means the pretender to the throne. Okay, so Moses, and even the Bible said that Moses was educated as a high Egyptian. He was taught all the secrets of the Anunnaki. And here you can see that the stories are just identical. We get one version on Moses in the Bible, and the other comes from the hieroglyphics of the Egyptians, but they tell the same story. But so where did Moses, when they got into the Promised Land and they were traveling through the desert for 40 years, what kept them from starving to death? Well, they'd wake up in the morning and there'd be a white powder lying around on the ground. And they ask, what is it? And in ancient Hebrew, the term for what is it is manna. So they'd pick up this manna and they'd roll it into little cakes, and they'd bake it, and they'd eat it, and everybody got along and they survived quite well. Well, what is this manna? What is it? It's the white powder. It's the white powder, the mafus, the conical bread that the Egyptians were using, that Moses knew about because of his knowledge of these ancient technologies and secrets. And we now know that this white powder is what they call orbitally rearranged monatomic elements, single cell elements, and that can change through a smelting process. For one thing, when I was a kid back here, that was the atom that we were taught back about the time Disney was showing us Our Friend the Atom. This is what we know an atom looks like now, and it's really quite incredible and quite complicated. And the main thing about an atom is you've got your little nucleus, and then you got a few protons and neutrons rolling around, but for the most part, an atom is empty space. Now gets pretty weird, but this is getting to the crux of the matter. The whole universe is simply atoms, neutrons and protons floating all around, but they bunch together and form something fairly solid. This solid table seems there, you don't want to bang your head on it, it'll hurt. And yet, scientifically, we know that this is just a bunch of excited atoms. And these atoms are mostly empty space. And I think this explains a lot of phenomena, people who are able to suddenly lift heavy weights or ghosts, how they never move through walls, because it's all mostly empty space. If you can allow your empty space with that empty space, you ought to be able to just slip on through. But that's pretty much out of the range of most of us. They are using this same type of monolithic monatomic gold in experimenting on the new fuel cell technology. And this is just a list of some of the scientific papers. You don't hear much about this because it's pretty obscure and it's pretty esoteric, and it probably would cause a lot of problems to some of the monopolies that certain groups and certain families have on energy, pharmaceuticals, etc. But these papers show quite clearly that that this is again a means of manipulating energy. For example, in the monatomic gold, the atom tends to distort during this change from a solid to through a gaseous to this white powder, and it assumes a dumbbell shape. I found that real interesting because to me it looks really similar to the symbol for infinity. But the real clincher is that they found when they put this white powder in a weighing scale, the pan they put it in weighs 44% less than it did before you put the powder in it. So it has anti-gravitic properties. And so this is things that we need to be looking at about to power anti-gravity vehicles. And because the whole universe is energy, and if you think of the galaxies and how they all swirl, have you ever thought about what makes them swirl? Why do they turn? Okay? And so what we're finding is that with a swirling motion, you can get a lot of power. Just ask a tornado. So we are finally beginning to unlock some of these secrets of the universe, and it has very little or nothing to do with ramjets and fuels. Another illustration of the white powder of gold in operation is the story of Moses, who goes up to the Mount of Moses up on the mountain and gets the tables of destiny and also the 10 Commandments. And then he comes down, he finds out the children of Israel have been taking their gold and making it into an idol because they knew there was something magical about it. They just didn't quite know what. And it made him mad, and he broke the 10 Commandments, had to go back to the mountain and say, Lord, I'm sorry, I broke the commandments. He said, can you give me some more? And God said, nope, sorry, only one to a customer. And so this is something else we don't realize, is that the 10 Commandments are copies of copies because he broke the original ones. I just hope he remembered it all correctly. So he got mad and said, and according to the Bible, he took this golden calf and he melted it down and made them drink it. Well, now, wait a minute. If you melted gold and you make somebody drink it, that's going to kill them. But this didn't kill him. So obviously he did something else. What he did was use the smelting process and turned it into the manna. They made them consume the gold in the form of monatomic powder. And where did he get it? In 1904, the British archaeologist Sir William Petrie discovered what he described as a Egyptian temple on Mount Horeb in the Sinai, which is also known as the Mount of Moses. And when they were excavating there, they pulled up the flagstones, and underneath was a quantity of white powder. He says, "What's this?" Nobody knew. They didn't know what it was, so they just left it open, and the wind blew it all away. And, so this is where they were making the manna. Meanwhile, they were raiding and warring all through the wilderness. And after 40 years, they had collected a pretty good pile of wealth and treasure, not only gold and silver, but ancient text and scrolls and things tell them about it. So now we have the story of Solomon, who builds his temple there. And interestingly enough, the design of Solomon's temple is an exact copy of a Sumerian temple that had been built many thousands of years before. So this tells us that this knowledge and this technology is being passed along down through the generations, but unfortunately, it gets garbled as it goes along. Some of you may have played the old parlor game. Some of you may have played the old parlor game where you get a line of people and one of them whispers something, and then you turn and whisper to the one next to you. And by the time it gets down at the end of the line, it very often does not sound much like anything like what was originally stated. But up here we see also that the Solomon's temple, the actual worship place, was back at the back, and it was relatively small. The rest of it was this huge barn-like edifice, and that's just where they stored this huge treasure. So what happened to Solomon's treasure? Probably the greatest treasure in the history of the world. Not only gold, silver, precious stones, and true wealth, but also a wealth of ancient knowledge. Okay, well, in 66 AD, we have the Jewish revolt. They revolted against the Romans, and the Romans weren't going to take that, so they came back, and in 70 AD, they sacked Jerusalem. Well, you got 66 and 70, you got 4 years there, so they knew the Romans would be coming back, and they knew that they would not be satisfied by just hiding the treasure, because then they'd look for it and look for it. So they took half the treasure, the best half, probably some of the best knowledge particularly, and they sealed it in the catacombs under what used to be Solomon's temple, and by then had become the palace of Herod the king. And sure enough, in 70 AD, when the Romans arrive and they sack Jerusalem and they take over the palace of Herod, and they go through there and they get half the treasure, say. And they might have had the thought, well, we thought there was more than this, but there it is, that's all they got. So what do they do with it? They haul it back to Rome as war booty. So half the treasure is in Rome, the other half is under the temple in Jerusalem. 400 years later, Alaric the Goth, who comes from southern France and led a Roman army and then revolted and brought his army to Rome and sacked Rome. It was the first sacking of Rome by the non-Romans. And he gained this Solomon's treasure. And he took it back to his home stomping grounds, which were the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains in southern France, the Languedoc region. And there they rested for a number of years, and only the people in the area knew about this, and they had access to these scrolls and to these things, so they knew. And so this is what led to the Albigensian Crusade, because this gave rise to the Cathars, which was a religious sect that believed in purity, believed in simplicity, they believed in women participating in the church. They didn't believe in edifices and artifacts. They worshipped out in the woods and in the clearings and everything. And of course, that did not sit well with the Roman Church, which by this time had been crystallized thanks to Paul and Constantine, who then just declared that the Roman Empire was Christian. And so they sent the Albigensian Crusaders in there, and they massacred everyone they could find. This is where the line came from that the Pope's commander sent word back to Rome saying, well, everybody here looks alike, How do I know who's the Cathars and who's not? And the Pope very famously said, kill them all, let God sort them out, And we still are practicing that. I remember there was an officer in Vietnam who said essentially the same thing. He said, kill them all, let God sort them out. So, but they didn't entirely wipe them out, because a lot of the Cathars simply took off their robes and blended in with the population, went right on. So over time, some of the families there, there was they had their big final stand at Monsignor, but there were surviving Cathar families like the Blanchefords and the St. Clairs and their relative St. Bernard, and they knew about the rest of the treasure over in Jerusalem. So over time, they fomented the First Crusade. We got to go bring freedom and democracy to the Middle East, okay? But actually, they were after the treasure. And in 1099, the Crusaders actually did conquer Jerusalem. And they immediately, the same families, the same people that started it all, set up a military order called the Poor Knights of the Temple. And the idea was they were going to guard the roadways to Jerusalem for the European missionaries and religious people making their treks. But they didn't really ever do that. They spent 9 years excavating under Solomon's temple or under Herod's palace, and they recovered the rest of Solomon's treasure. And they hauled it back to their home stomping grounds in southern France. Now, Solomon's treasure is reunited in the cave systems of the foothills of the Pyrenees. But because of the wealth they gathered, plus the knowledge, these poor Knights of the Temple, which became known as the Knights Templars, became very strong and wealthy and became a competitor to the Roman Church. And they did all kinds of things other than a lot of wealth, other than a lot of money. They were the first, they had their own sailing fleet, and they were the first to use magnetic compasses. In fact, something about the Templar fleet that just blew me away was we all know and love pirates. Arr, matey, avast. And but if you go back, you'll find that early on, the pirates, the people who flew the black skull and bones on a black flag, had letters of marque from England, which gave them permission, and they raided mostly French and Spanish ships. The black flag with the white skull and crossbones, it turns out, is the naval ensign of the Knights Templars. So they were carrying on the warfare between the church and it's amazing. And then, of course, later on, there were some freebooters who said, well, we run out of French and Spanish ships, let's raid an English ship. And that's, of course, where they became that's where we get the pirates. So Solomon's treasure is united again. Came from Jerusalem, ended up in the foothills of the Languedoc region. They also brought architecture to Europe. Before the Knights Templars, every building in Europe had just been a block house, with just stones, and that's it. Maybe a turret, and that was it. They came back and started building the Gothic cathedrals. That in Gothic, that name comes from the Greek gote, meaning magical, because they suddenly had archways and flying buttresses and and stuff people had never seen before, and it was magical to them. They also, at Chartres Cathedral, and I've been there, they have stained glass that is so luminescent that modern science doesn't really know how they were able to do that. And another thing that got me when I went to Chartres was I knew about this stained glass, and so I asked some of the curators, I said, where's the oldest stained glass? And they said, well, it's in the knee of the front. So I went up there, and sure enough, there's little round windows with all this beautiful stained glass in it. Well, I'm expecting to see pictures of Jesus on the cross or Mary on her donkey or, you know, biblical scenes. No. It was a horoscope. It was Sagittarius and what am I trying to say here? A zodiac. Thank you. It was a zodiac. Okay, so see, they were into this stuff. And this is just, you can see some of the stained glass and some of the archways. And you can see that they're carrying on the knowledge between, here's ancient Egyptian and then here's European. This over here was in an Egyptian temple and the other's in a Hebrew temple. So it's all the same stuff. All the same stuff. And then we find that all through the Middle Ages, we have the alchemists. And what were the alchemists doing? Well, you know, popularly we know they were trying to turn lead into gold. But actually, they knew that gold had some kind of magical property, and they were trying to figure out how to do this and how to make the white powder. And in fact, one of the alchemists, Irenaeus Valenius, said, our stone is nothing but gold digested to the highest degree of purity and subtle fixation of very fine powder. So the philosopher's stone was a white powder. This is the white powder of gold. And this became known to a village priest named Saunier at Rennes-le-Château, a little hilltop village in southern France in the Pyrenees. And he suddenly became very rich and was hobnobbing with the Habsburgs and some of the other royal leaders of Europe. And because of something he had learned, and we don't quite know what it was, it's a big mystery. If you ever read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, that's what they're talking about. And apparently, though, he did tell his live-in housekeeper his secret, and she promised to tell one of her close friends before she died, but didn't make it. She died, and she still didn't tell him, and so we don't know precisely what it was, but it is surmised that Father Saunier knew where the Solomon's treasure was located and may have gotten the bits and pieces of here and there, and that's why the royals were all after him, because everybody wanted that. You can see that the Masonic, here's Rennes-le-Château, and here's a diagram of Washington, D.C. It's all done by the Masons. The Masons are the offshoots of the Knights Templars, because the Knights Templars became the rivals of the Vatican, and they moved against them in 1311, I believe, on a Friday, which is Friday the 13th. That's where we get that boogaboo. And so by then, the Templars had broken into two main groups. They had speculative Freemasonry and operative Freemasonry, because at the time, early on in the Knights Templar, when they realized they were going to have a problem with the Vatican, they began to form stonemason guilds. I mean, the reason for that is that the stonemason guilds, these are the masons that would go around from town to town and build the cathedrals in the cities of Europe. And as such, they were among the only group that was able to freely travel around Europe during the Middle Ages. And so this was their way of having a communication information system. So they formed these stonemason guilds, and then it broke into operative and speculative. Well, operative, these were the guys that were real stonemasons and actually built things. And then speculative were people like us that wanted to join and wanted to learn some of the secrets and wanted to be a member, but were not actually hands-on masons. So they built Washington, they helped build the United States, and just briefly here, you might have seen the Dan Brown thing, his famous book and the movie, the Da Vinci Code, and they're talking about, in the famous picture of Jesus' Last Supper, you can see there's a distinctive V shape there that separates him from the figure to his right. And if you'll go and look at all the other figures, they've all got beards and they're pretty husky looking. And this one, who they try to say is John, but this is actually Mary Magdalene, his wife. And in France today, it's like, oh yeah, we all know that. Because while I was at Rennes-le-Chateau, I'm looking out and I see there's a very obvious cave over here across the valley. And this professor that I was with from Belgium says, oh yeah, that's the cave of Mary Magdalene. I said, oh, they named it after her? And he said, no, that's where she lived. All right, because according to their story, after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene, Jesus' wife, and his children fled and landed in southern France, and that's where they lived, and that's where you get into a whole thing about that they blended with and intermarried in the bloodlines there and created the Merovingians, the would-be kings, the poet kings of Europe. But obviously, but then they argued, no, that was just John, and he was kind of effeminate looking. And yet I found 3 examples of the Last Supper, one by Durr, one by Foucault, and another early German thing, and all 3 of them show Jesus there with a woman. So see, we've been kind of messed around on that whole story. Also, from Rennes-le-Chateau, if you'll take some of the holy places that they're already marking around there, we find that it's all a huge pentagram type shape, and in fact, it's called the Temple of Isis. So you've got this feminine aspect to the whole thing that we don't usually get told about. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant is a big part of that. In this Nicolas Poussin painting back over here, you see in the background the Ark of the Covenant. And in fact, the Ark of the Covenant's been revered all the way down through the centuries. Here's a Knights Templar meeting in Paris in 1147. They got the Ark, the Royal Ark Room today in Washington, D.C. The Ark's a big piece of Freemasonry. And we now know that what the Ark looked like because the Bible gives us the dimensions. And the lid, or the mercy seat, is 3.5 inches thick, made of pure gold. Estimated to weigh 2,714 pounds. And yet we see the illustrations and descriptions of 4 or 5 guys carrying it around. How can they carry that kind of weight? Well, wait a minute. It's full of the white powder. The white powder has anti-gravity properties. So they're not carrying it around, they're just guiding it. Okay, and not only has it got anti-gravity properties, but apparently they somehow used it as a communication device, because on several occasions they say they were able to talk to God through the mercy seat. And it was also probably some kind of superconductor, because when certain people would run up and try to put their hands on it, they'd shock them or kill them. All right, so there's obviously something going on there. And again, it's back to the ancient technology. We're beginning now to find this out here, because they've got a ceramic superconductor that is able to hang that in midair, anti-gravity in action. And so was the Ark of the Covenant a low-frequency wave field superconductor capable of creating a Meissner field, which can nullify a magnetic field of gravity? And by the way, if you hadn't figured it out, this is what makes the UFOs fly. They don't use jets. They ride energy fields, and they are surrounded by energy fields that negate gravity. But also, what we're finding out is they not only negate gravity, they negate time. Okay, the story is when the UFO field comes over, the car stops. And then when the UFO goes away, the car starts again, it's okay. Except nobody ever said, yeah, the UFO went away and I started a car, started the starter, No. When the field comes in there and it's nullifying the gravity and allowing the craft to move and hover, time stops. The pistons stop. And then when it goes away, the pistons go back to banging and the thing's working again. This also explains another phenomenon of the UFO issue, which is missing time. Guy says, I saw a UFO at 6 o'clock, and then I rushed home, but I didn't get home till 7 o'clock, but I only lived 5 minutes away. What happened to the time? Well, he's in the energy field. Time stands still for him. As I say, in 1307, the Knights Templars are then attacked, and this has all been one big movement to try to, from the Vatican Church, to try to stop the spread of information. The Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland was built by the Sinclairs after they fled because of the Albigensian Crusade. And in Rosslyn Chapel, we find carvings of cactus and corn and stuff that they didn't have in Europe. And so this means they were traveling to North America long before Columbus came over here. The Masons, of course, are just a big part of that. And here's a picture of George Washington. And of course, within the Masons, they began to build up the Illuminati. In 1776, they created the Bavarian Illuminati, which was based on Masonic orders. In a 1798 letter George Washington wrote, he said, it was not my intention to doubt that the doctrines of the Illuminati had not spread to the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of this fact than I am. And again, we see the layout of Washington and the fact that it was all done according to Masonic lore. Now, in Freemasonry, you have a big outer circle and a small inner circle. And if you ask any Freemason about that, they're going to say, no, that's not right. Because if you're a member of the outer circle, you genuinely do not know that there is this inner circle. And if you're a member of the inner circle, then you've taken a blood oath never to reveal that, okay? So that's one of their secrets. But I really don't have time to get into this today, but I'll tell you the biggest secret of the Freemasons is they don't have any secrets. Because the original Freemasonry that involved the European Freemasonry and Sir Francis Bacon and John Dee and people at that point, once the revolution took place and once King James was run out of England and a lot of his followers went with him, there went the original Masons, and they lost pretty much all their knowledge. And it was only later that they reconstituted the big main hall there in England and reconstituted Freemasonry, and they just started from scratch and said, well, that was a good idea, let's redo that. And they started making up some of their own stuff, so see where we are. Okay, yeah, here's Weifhoffen. He's the guy who started the Bavarian Illuminati, okay? And then the Bavarian Illuminati was the first to really play on the Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian dialectic sounds real complicated, but it's not. It is thesis versus antithesis versus synthesis. That sounds complicated. All right, let's say you and I want to go to the movies, and you want to go see movie A. That's thesis. That's your thesis. You want to see movie A. I don't want to see movie A. I want to see movie B. So that's antithesis. All right. So what do? Well, we flip a coin, or we probably, if it's like me and my wife, we just say, and we both give in and say, okay, we'll go see movie C. Well, that's synthesis. All right. And so that we find all this all the way down through history. But see, they hit on a secret. They said, it's conflict and anti-conflict and then resolution. But why wait for conflict? Let's generate conflict. So this is what they do today. They generate conflict. And you can see what happens like in our own country. At the time of World War II, when we truly had some enemies, enemies that wanted to invade and conquer this country, the whole idea was we unite as Americans. Black, white, red, yellow, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Catholic. We're all just Americans, and as Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And we're going to roll up our sleeves and take care of stuff. But that was World War II. Look at today. Terrorism alert, orange today. Wait a minute, what does that mean? You know, and does that mean New York? Or does that mean San Francisco? Does that mean LA? Does that mean Joshua Tree? Does that mean Wise County, Texas? What am I supposed to get in a stance there, you know, be ready for anything? And so they got everybody fearful, and then it's all divide, you know, man versus woman, black versus white, poor versus rich, homosexual versus heterosexual, and man, anything, just anything to divide everybody. See, because what's the oldest trick in the book? Divide and conquer. Now, we even find that they got the American Revolution took place and actually worked, so the French got upset and they wanted to do the same thing, and it's been pretty well acknowledged that the French Revolution was inspired by the Masons. And so here we see, again, you can't tell a player without a program, because sometimes they're operating from a benevolent standpoint, and sometimes it's not so benevolent. But even the late, great War of Yankee Aggression, as we call it down in Texas. Some people call it the Civil War. I refuse to do that because there was nothing civil about it. But we find that was instigated by the powers in Europe. The Rothschilds sent a guy, one of their employees, Dr. George Bickley, and he created the Knights of the Golden Circle based on Freemasonry, and he began to stir up all the problems there between the North and the South, trying to create a slave-owning empire that stretched all the way through the American South, through the Caribbean, in through Mexico, and into Southern America. And at one time, he had a lot of followers. Sam Houston even was a member, and so was the assassin of President Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth. He was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And see, you don't hear about these secret societies that are fomenting all of this stuff. This is Auguste Belmont. You've probably heard of the Belmont Raceway. He was a big horse fancier, but he also was an employee of the Rothschilds. And he comes over here, and by the time of the war, he was in charge of financing the North in its war effort. Meanwhile, one of the younger Rothschilds was financing the South because they needed the cotton for their textile mills in England. Even the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, he laid it out. He said, the division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. The voice of the Rothschilds prevailed. They sent their emissaries into the field to exploit the question of slavery and to open an abyss between the two sections of the Union. So the plan was, if you stop and think about it, go back and look at the big perception, Britain and France had always fought over who was going to control North America. But the British had kind of come out on top, and then when they bought up the Louisiana Purchase, they pretty well bought up France's interest, and then all of it was pretty much Britain, okay? But then the colonists revolted and threw out the British, and so they wanted it back. France wanted it back. Spain wanted their cut of it, okay? But how are you going to do that with the United States here? So the idea was, we're going to pitch the North against the South. They'll bleed each other dry. The British Army is in Canada. And where was the French Army? Mexico, under Maximilian. So they bleed both sides dry, and then they move in and conquer North America. Now, the one fella who seemed to maybe have a handle on this and understand what was going on was Abraham Lincoln, okay? And that's why he said all along, he said, we've got to hold the Union together. And he said, if I do that by freeing the slaves, I'll do that. If I could do that without freeing any slaves, I'd do that too. Okay? So he saw what was happening, and he held it all together. So that takes us, and then after that, that takes us all the way up. But now the Rothschilds did not get to gain control over North America, so they had to figure out how we're going to do this. And how they did that was right there towards the end of the Civil War. They had begun to realize that this black oily substance oozing up from the ground might actually be worth something, because up until then they'd used it to grease axle wheels and maybe a little bit for lanterns. But now they begin to realize with the age of machines that they needed this black petroleum for fuel and for lubricants. And who gets control of it? John D. Rockefeller. And how did he do that? Well, because he went and started with a loan from the Bank of Cleveland. And the Bank of Cleveland was a registered Rothschild bank. So they set him up, they set the Rockefellers up as their surrogates in North America, because the Rothschilds were already catching flack in Europe for playing those countries off against each other for perpetual war and profit. That brings us to about 1910. They had a meeting at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia of most of the big bankers here, and coming over and joining in was Paul Warburg, a member of the Warburg family, close relatives to the Rothschilds, and those families have been together for several centuries. And he comes over, and the first thing you know, he is the chairman of the first Federal Reserve System. And he's telling them all about how the German banking system works, and this is how you do it here. Now, they originally they had fomented some booms and busts, and everybody was mad at the bankers. So they came up with a big banking bill, and they were going to say, this is how it's going to work. But everybody said, no, that's the bankers, and look what they've already done to us. We're not going to go for that. So, in their own words, they had a conspiracy, and they came up with the idea of a Federal Reserve System. And whatever you do, don't call it a central bank. Now, I don't know about some of you older folks. If you think back, when we were kids and young folks growing up, you never heard them refer to the central bank. It was always just the Fed or the Federal Reserve System. But now, so much time's gone by, and nobody understands this stuff. So now they just tell us, yeah, the central bank today upped interest rates or whatever. So now it's all out of the closet, so to speak. Okay, so they came and got the European Rothschild-type banking system in place in this country, and then rammed it through on December the 23rd or 24th, 1913, while most of Congress is out of session. And that's where we get the Federal Reserve System. Interestingly enough, Paul Warburg's brother, Max, was also head of the German central bank, and mixed up with German intelligence. In fact, was one of the people who helped sneak Lenin through wartime Germany and into Russia to foment the Russian Revolution and take it communist and pull Russia out of World War I. He also was a founder of the IG Farben chemical combine, the biggest, deadliest chemical company ever, and all of the modern pharmaceutical companies all in one way or another tie back to IG Farben, either because they were part of it or because they have licenses and patents and agreements. He also was a member of the Hamburg America Steamship Line along with Prescott Bush. And during World War II, this was the line that they brought in Nazi money and Nazi saboteurs. And in fact, Prescott Bush was actually prosecuted in November of 1942 for being nothing but a financial front man for Hitler and the Nazis. You didn't hear much about that because they just fined him a few $1 million, which was pocket change to him. They did run him out of Connecticut and had to come to Texas, buy his way in. That's why I've always been griped about the Bushes. Everybody thinks they're Texas oil men. No, they're Yankee carpetbaggers, okay? And, but here's an interesting point, especially, any of y'all been in the military? Good, okay. In the summer of 1942, when Prescott, bound to have known that they were investigating him, he was about to get in trouble for his dealings with the Nazis, what does he do? He forms the United Service Organization, the USO. And if you know anything, the USO is so beloved by military people. I know when I was in the Army, man, I loved the USO. And if y'all ever watch any of those old World War II movies out of Hollywood, you know, USO Canteen, you know, it's where you get a little taste of home. You get some pretty girl with a donut, you know. It's great. Everybody loved the USO. What a propaganda disaster. In the middle of World War II, how could they have said that the guy that founded the USO is a Nazi supporter, you know? Couldn't do it. So he might have been a bad guy, but he wasn't stupid. And then, so in World War I, we got two brothers, bankers on both sides, running both sides of the war. And that goes right on. The money that went from the United States to Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution, according to President Woodrow Wilson, the bulk of that money went to the communists, went to the Bolsheviks, not to the white Russians, not to the Kerensky government. So in other words, the bankers created communism in Russia. Here's an old cartoon from 1911. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch shows Lenin shaking hands with, Karl Marx shaking hands with J.P. Morgan and Perkins, Teddy Roosevelt, and John Ryan, John D. Rockefeller. See, they're all in there, and they created communism. But it got out of hand. They created a Frankenstein monster. Now, when Lenin was in charge, he even griped that he wasn't in charge. I think, what was his line? His line was, the driver turns the wheel one way, but it goes another way, or something. Test. Nope. I got this one turned off. This one. All right, that's all right. Test. Turn me on. Now, there's so much going here. I got to get going. We're never going to get to the good stuff. Test. Okay, let's go. All right, so they created communism in Russia, but when Stalin took over, he was a dictator. They kind of lost control. He allowed for the creation of the international communism, and they were going around, workers of the world unite, and this struck fear into the moneyed people and the bankers in the West, the very people who created them in the first place. So they turned to the one country where that was in a position to act as a block against the spread of Russian communism, and that, of course, was Germany. And so they went in Germany, they found a German army intelligence agent, and they sent him out to look at these little political parties that were going on, and he found one called the German Workers' Party. And he went back to his superiors and said, "You're going to like these guys. They think the Jews caused us to lose World War I, and that we ought to rearm, and we ought to be the powerhouse of the world," and all like that. And they went, "Yeah, we like that. Let's build everything back up." And of course, that was Adolf Hitler. So they created National Socialism in Germany. And the difference is that the communism was an extreme form of socialism, but they wanted to extend it worldwide, and the wealthy people didn't want that, so they wanted to create National Socialism, which is still socialism, but it's confined within a national boundary. And backing him was the Thule Society, the Vril Society, some of these occult societies that included members of the aristocracy and of the wealthy industrialists. So he got all the support he could to build it all up. And of course, we all know from the Indiana Jones movies that they were all out looking for these sacred occult relics because they were looking for alternative technology. Meanwhile, a kid named Otto Rahn back in the 20s had traveled around in southern France and had written a book about the Cathars and had almost become a Cathar himself. He decided they were really pure and they were good and they were godly, and he kind of liked them, and and he was a mountain climber and a spelunker. And he came to the attention of so he was writing about the Cathars and about the Albigensian Crusade and about Solomon's treasure. So who globs onto him but Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. And in 1936, they made Ron a member of the SS. But then by February of 1939, he resigned from the SS. Apparently, he decided these Nazis were not the guys he really wanted to be mixed up with. And a month later, he was reported died in a snowstorm or hiking. This guy had done it his entire life. But they probably had gotten the information from him, because in 1943, southern France was Vichy France, supposedly independent, but actually just a satellite of the Nazis, and the Germans actually occupied northern France. And then in the fall of 43, Italy revolted, and they grabbed Mussolini and they put him under arrest in a mountaintop hotel, and were going to join the Allies. But Hitler sent his top commando, Otto Skorzeny, and in a daring daylight raid, they landed on the mountaintop. They got Mussolini. They managed to take off, and they flew Mussolini back to Hitler, and he declared that Italy was still in the war. And from then on, we were still fighting in Italy, but not fighting the Italians. We were fighting the Germans, who were occupying Italy, and the war went on down there. So Hitler used this as an excuse to say, I have to protect the soft underbelly of Europe, and so he pushed troops into southern France. So by the end of 1943, the Germans had then taken over and occupied southern France. And on March 1944, a month or so later, Otto Skorzeny is sent to southern France with a battalion of SS troopers based on the information they'd gotten from Otto Rahn. And on March the 16th, he sends a one-word telegram back to Berlin simply reading, Eureka. The Nazis got Solomon's treasure. Not only the wealth, but some of the technological secrets. And there are stories of sealed railroad cars and pack trains coming out of the foothills, hauling all this back to Germany. Some of it was put in the tunnels under Berchtesgaden, some of it spread out, and some of it sent overseas. We don't know what happened to it all. This gives you some indication, though. These are bags of gold that the Allies uncovered there at Merkers at the end of the war, 1945, and that's just one catch that they found. So this is a drop in the bucket. So that gives you some idea of the wealth and power that the Nazis were able to take out after the war. And so what most people don't realize is that we defeated the German military in World War II, but we never defeated the Nazis. There was nobody representing the Nazi party at the surrender, and in fact they didn't surrender. We just forced them to move. And they went to Egypt, they went to Argentina, and thousands of them came over here under Operation Paperclip, which was run by John J. McCloy, the banker who, as head of National City Bank, which is now Citicorp, in the 30s was the largest lender of money to Hitler and the Nazis. And then at the end of the war, he becomes the High Commissioner of Germany, sends all these Nazis right over here where his protege, Alan Dulles, who he and his brother, John Foster Dulles, had been legal representatives of the Kurt von Schroeder Bank, who was Hitler's biggest supporter. So they're all Nazis. And he's over here now, Dulles is head of the CIA, whitewashing their backgrounds and allow them into our military-industrial complex. And of course, the problem with that is when we got their technology, we got their jets, we got their rockets, we got their psychiatric drugs and mind control techniques, but we also got their political philosophy, National Socialism. But of course, today you can't say National Socialism because everybody knows anybody that knows that in the German acronym that's Nazi. So today they call themselves neocons. They got all kinds of stuff, including flying saucers. Here's some of the prints, yeah. And they were working on very exotic things like a super collider, superconductor there in Poland. This General Hans Kammler was in charge of that. And Morton Bormann, who was chief of staff to Hitler and the head of the German Central Bank and head of the IG Farben Combine, got together and created Action Adlerflug, which is Operation Eagle Flight, which was taking everything worth anything out of Germany. So in other words, we just made them move, and they set up thousands of corporations all around the world, and we're still having to deal with them. And this will give you some idea of the corporations that participated with them. But let's hurry on. And then, and IBM had an office in Berlin, but when the war started, they very patriotically shut that down. But they didn't shut down their office in Warsaw. And through the office in Warsaw, they were sending these IBM punch card computers that the Nazis were using to herd up all the Jews and load them in trains and haul them to the concentration camp. It's just business, don't worry about it. Same deal going on today. Now you understand, or I hope you're beginning to understand what's happening here. They all said that we were going to have anti-gravity craft, coming. And then all of a sudden that went dark. You never hear any more about that. I don't know what that is. Anyway, we tried to build our own flying saucers. Couldn't quite work. And then, of course, in June of 1947, we have Kenneth Arnold, who said he saw this craft near Mount Rainier, and they were skimming along like saucers being tossed across the water. So he wasn't even talking about what they looked like. He was talking about their flying ability, but that gave rise to flying saucers. And now the people who were in on the know of all this, Dulles and John Foster Dulles and all of these guys, they all belong to these secret societies like the Council on Foreign Relations. Now that's not secret because we all know it's there. They even have a website and publish Foreign Affairs publication, but you and I can't join. You only join if they vet you and they decide that your worldview is in agreement with theirs. And they consolidated then, the Nazis came over here, and the very same people who had created the Nazis created communism, and now they're back to their original game plan, which was they're going to pit a communist East versus a capitalist West. This came to be known, what we've known as the Cold War. Got your Trilateral Commission, which was an offshoot of the Council on Foreign Relations. Some of their top people formed the Trilateral Commission, and that was simply to bring the Asian economies into this world socialist system. And that's their logo, and kind of looks amazingly like a stylized swastika, doesn't it? Back there you see it. And then you've got the youth contingent, which is Order 322 of the German Illuminati, but what is more commonly known as the Order of Skull and Bones, okay? And I call it the springboard to the secret societies. All the Bush guys, they're all members of Skull and Bones. You can just go down the list and find the number of people who end up being national leaders. We get to the Korean War, and we find that you can read the names of the two generals. One Russian general was in charge of the North Korea. It was advising them. In fact, it is said that he's the one that gave the orders to launch an invasion into South Korea and start the Korean action. At the same time, we were operating and fighting in Korea under the aegis of the United Nations and under the office that's run by another Russian general. So in other words, Russian generals running both sides of the Korean War. And we almost lost that as it hadn't been for Douglas MacArthur. And what did he do? He sneaked around and launched an invasion at Incheon, but he didn't tell anybody. And that's what got him fired by President Truman, because he didn't follow the protocol. But if he had, we would have probably lost the Korean War. It's just deals, just deals. Then we got Johnson comes in after Kennedy's assassination, and he's got his wise men. His entire cabinet is Council on Foreign Relations. So these same banker industrialist types that have been running everything since year one, and they're still in control. And then we finally get Reagan, who apparently was not part of all of that, but then he's shot right away. And by the way, the guy that actually shot Reagan is up here on this balcony up here, because Sirhan was over in this crowd over, not Sirhan, Hinckley was in this crowd right here, and as you can see, he's on a parallel thing, and the shot that got Reagan came at a downward angle. And Jessica Savage, who's one of the newscasters at the time, and this really struck me because she said there was a shot from the grassy knoll. What? Come on. But there is, on the top of this wall, this little brick wall right here, was a little grassy area, and you can see the photograph of this guy crouched up in here. And Hinckley had a 6-shot revolver, and there were like 8 shots fired. Wait a minute. So it's between 1963 and about 1980, whenever, all our politics were decided by gunfire. Oh, here we go. That shows you. And then it started getting a little bit too obvious, so they've backed off now. They don't need to worry about this now, because now they've got computer voting. Now, this is true. In 1979, getting towards the end, getting late in 79, getting ready to go into the election year of 1980, and everybody was griping about Jimmy Carter, saying that he couldn't make up his mind, he wasn't doing anything, he was a do-nothing president. So Carter asked for TV time, and he said he was going to make sweeping changes in the government. And but then he goes out to California, goes to Los Angeles for a Cinco de Mayo celebration thing. And I remember the little news item is about one paragraph buried in the back of the paper said that they had arrested a man there, and that he said it was part of a plot that killed Carter. And Secret Service said, nothing to this. But a week later, there was another little thing that said they had arrested another guy, and said it was part of this plot to kill Carter, but nothing to it, folks. So I kept reading and keeping up with that, and finally, Newsweek, I guess it was, ran a little article on it, and sure enough, these two guys, Carter was the object of an assassination plot by Raymond Lee Harvey and Oswaldo Ortiz. So Lee Harvey and Oswaldo were going to kill Carter in 1979, and Carter went into seclusion at Fort David and canceled his TV program, never did anything to try to have his sweeping changes in the government, and of course handily got defeated by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan then tells everybody, on the campaign trail, he said, Bush is a Nazi and a secret society member, and he said, I'll never allow George Herbert Walker Bush into my administration. And that's why one reason he so handily got the nomination, because anybody knew anything knew the Bushes were crooked. But then we get to the Republican National Committee convention, and Reagan gets the nomination right off the bat, and the only question becomes, who's he going to choose as a vice president? Well, it gets to be the middle of the week, and everybody's still arguing and haranguing, and all of a sudden the paid news pundits, anchors, start talking about the dream ticket. Well, let's put up Gerald Ford, because Gerald Ford's already been president. He's experienced, good Republican. So we'll have Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford as his vice president. But of course, since Gerald Ford has already been president, then he gets to select half the cabinet. So in other words, in the middle of the convention, Reagan is faced with the possibility of half a presidency, half power. So on a Wednesday night, he goes rushing into the floor of the Republican National Convention and says, I want to clear up all of this theorizing and everything. He says, I choose George Bush. So they got George Herbert Walker Bush as his vice president, and less than 2 months later, he's shot, and George Herbert Walker Bush is actually running the country. Now, you all may or may not remember the Iran-Contra scandal, which is where they were trying to get a war going in Central America. All right, now right after Reagan gets elected in November of 1980, and there was only one person, probably, because Dr. King was dead, there's only one person probably that could have been an immediate lightning rod for an anti-war movement. And they wanted to get a war going in Central America. So they got to do something about this guy. They've been trying to deport him for years, and they couldn't quite get it done. So, you know who I'm talking about? John Lennon. So less than a month after Reagan's elected, John Lennon's shot down in front of his hotel or his room there in New York, and by a guy who just stands there, you know, Mark David Chapman, and who had just gone out that morning and bought a few copies of Catcher in the Rye, which was, if you've ever seen the movies, the Manchurian Candidate, then you know this is his trigger. Okay. Same thing with Sirhan Sirhan, a prison psychiatrist worked with Sirhan Sirhan, who still says he can't remember what happened in the Ambassador Hotel, and the psychiatrist said he's got hypnotic blocks. So these, see, they've gotten more sophisticated. Oswald was just a schnook who was a patsy, as he himself said. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go. So Oswald and Lee Harvey stopped Carter. Who knows? I tried to find out. For one thing, you know, here the couple of stories when it was happening, they said, they quoted Secret Service saying, "There's nothing. This is the most nothing thing ever. This was just nothing." But then about a week later, it said both these guys had been charged with attempted assassination of the President of the United States and were being held on $1 million bond. Well, wait a minute. If it's a nothing deal, what? Same bunch. Same bunch. Right. Okay, so now we get to the Persian Gulf War, and Bush draws his line in the sand, but he just happens to draw it right there just before you get to his own oil property. And it's all a deal. It's all a deal. Saddam Hussein, if you go back and really look at it, Saddam Hussein was mad because they had quite illegally and forcibly, the British had carved out Kuwait out of Iraq back in the early 20s. And he claimed that they were slant drilling into his oil reserves, stealing his oil. So he finally has a meeting with the U.S. Ambassador, April Glaspie, first time he ever met with her, and basically says, what are you going to do if I regain the original boundaries of Iraq, which, you know, means what if he takes Kuwait? And she tells him, and she testified to this to Congress, she said, I've been instructed to tell you that we consider that an Arab issue, and we don't have any particular thought about that. Well, what does that sound like? Sounds like do what you want to do. So he moves into Kuwait, and all of a sudden he's the new Hitler. And there we go. Off we go into the first Gulf War. And the reason you don't ever hear of this stuff is because there are now 5 multinational corporations that control everything you see and hear. And I'm not just talking about news. I'm talking about magazines, book clubs, satellite, cable, movies, music, billboards, all under the control of one of 5 corporations with interlocking ownerships and directorships. Wilson says there is some of the biggest men in the United States are afraid of something. They know there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, they better not speak above their breath if they speak in condemnation of it. And we've heard this from other people too. It just goes on and on. Bill Moyers has talked about the secret government. So who are these secret governments? Then they drag us into war in Afghanistan. You know, why we invaded? Anybody remember why we invaded Afghanistan? Huh? Yeah, to get bin Laden. To get bin Laden. Did we get him? When they claim they got him, was he in Afghanistan? No. Now we got war in Iraq. And why did we go into Iraq? Weapons of mass destruction. Well, even before that is because he was building a nuclear weapon and he was going to have a nuclear bomb within 6 weeks, 9 weeks or so. Turned out, well, that's not right. So, no, it was weapon of mass destruction. Well, no, that wasn't right. So, we were after their oil. No, that's not right because we're getting less oil out of them now than we were before we invaded. So, I guess it was because we had to bring them freedom and democracy. Except, wait a minute, do y'all remember when Blackwater massacred all those people in a square over there? And the Iraqi government, our hand-picked little stooges, said, that's too much, get out. And the United States says, oh, no, they have contract. They don't have to get out. How's that for freedom and democracy? Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. It's just always a deal, always a deal. But meanwhile, all our liberties are being taken away in the name of the war on freedom. And it all started with 9/11. And if 9/11 somehow is a phony, then it's all phony. So now we're going to look at this. First off, we've got our official conspiracy theory. 19 crazed Muslim fanatics seize 4 separate airliners using little bitty box cutters, rug carpet cutters, unerringly fly them into buildings, bypassing and defeating our $400 billion defense system, all the while under the control of a Muslim cleric using a laptop computer in a cave in Afghanistan. It's the most ridiculous conspiracy theory I've ever heard, and yet that's what we're expected to believe. Okay, first off, I can't even see what's this all about. Yeah. 2000, even up to 2006, 60% said the government's involved. But let me go back. 9 of these hijackers that they've named turned up alive in the Middle East. They're not even the ones that we've been told about. And how do we know who they were anyway? They say all the planes were destroyed, everything was totally gone. Of course, they did find a paper passport lying in the street in New York and said it belonged to one of the hijackers. How fortuitous. Oh, here we go. These 7 hijackers, they all turned up alive. And this was reported in the European media. And some of them like were in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi Arabian foreign minister says, here he is, he didn't do this. And yet to this very day, the FBI has not changed the names of the hijackers that they told us. All right, but now Abu is going to give us an idea of what really happened. Abu Zabidah was one of the highest ranking Al-Qaeda chiefs, and he was caught in Pakistan in mid-2002. Ari Fleischer at that time was the press secretary for the White House, made a big deal about it. Said, we've caught one of the top Al-Qaeda guys, and we're going to make him talk. Well, he was one of the first ones to get tortured and waterboarded, but he wouldn't talk. He was tough. But then they pulled a trick on him. They got 3 Arab Americans and dressed them up like Saudis, and they took old Abu and they took him and said, we're taking you to a Saudi interrogation center, thinking that he'd be all afraid because, you know, the good old Americans, we try to play fair, but boy, those Saudis, they'll do anything. And so they took him, blindfolded him, flew him around a little bit and landed, and then took him in this facility that looked like a Saudi interrogation center and brought these 3 guys in on him. And instead of being fearful, he was relieved. Oh, good, I'm glad you guys are here, you know. And he started opening up and talking, and he said that he was secretly working for 3 Saudi princes, and that their cutout was an Air Marshal Mir of Pakistan that was passing the money and the orders back and forth. Now, who's the closest friends of the Saudis? The Bushes. They were in business with them. They were in business with the Bin Laden family. And they were in business with these princes. Now, once that story leaked out, all three of the princes and Air Marshal Mir suddenly turned up dead. Oh, they killed in a car crash. Oh, no. Plane went down. Oh, no. The one I liked was one of these Saudi princes. Now, here's an Arab, a prince in Saudi Arabia, and they said he died of dehydration. What, they don't know how to watch the water supply? Come on. It's almost humorous if it wasn't so serious, because they just play us for fools. And we don't know any better because we don't have a media. We don't have an honest media anymore. Okay, so now we get to the actual attacks on New York. And here on your right, I want you to notice those 47 steel columns going up through the middles of that World Trade Center. And you tell me an airplane, which is basically a flying beer can, because it's just a frame with light aluminum around it, weights everything on an airplane, and you tell me it's going to crash through those columns? And yet, see over here to the left, you see how the government plays with us. They showing this collapse, and they show, well, it starts a fire, and that hits, and then that pancakes down to the next one, and which pancakes down to the next one. But they're not showing you the entire floor. What they've diagrammed here is simply from here to here. None of this is taking into account all of these girders and supports. You notice the explosive nature of the whole thing there, and you notice, if you can go back and start looking at some of the pictures, you see what they call these squibs. See here and here. This is stuff blowing out below the floors that are collapsing. Now, if the building collapses and it's got all this structural steel in there, it's going to hesitate. Yeah, it might go down, but it's going to hesitate a little bit. All those buildings, including Building 7, just went because obviously all the supports had been knocked out. Also, if you've got a 110-story steel and glass and concrete building and it collapses down, it's been estimated you should have a debris pile of about 10 stories. This is what we have. This was taken right after it all fell. There's no more than 2 stories there. Where did it all go? Where'd the toilets go? Where'd the metal filing cabinets go? And in the midst of all that, we see Building 7, the Solomon Brothers building, standing right here, seemingly untouched. But it did have some debris flying around, caused a few little fires. But they apparently didn't think it was that bad because they pulled the firemen out at 10:30 that morning. Oh, they pulled the firemen out at 10:30 that morning, and then that afternoon, it just went down. After the firemen were seen running up the street going, the building's coming down, the building's coming down. Mm-hmm. But that's right. In Building 7 was a fortified emergency response center, which Giuliani did not even bother going to. And the thing about Giuliani that really sticks with me, because I saw this that was happening, he was on Versey Street in a makeshift command center, and they interviewed him as he's running down the street, and he's got dust and everything all over. And they said, yeah, we were in the command center, and a young man ran in and said, the building's coming down, and we were evacuating when the tower came down. Well, wait a minute. What young man? Who told him the building was coming down? Why didn't they tell the firemen in the building that it was coming down? How did they know it was coming down? We were told, oh my God, it fell down. Who was expecting that? Nobody. I get to that. Now this is where, here, the North Tower is over here. Here is Building 7. And notice how that it just collapsed right down into its own little footprint. Did not damage the Verizon building or the U.S. Post Office to either side of it. That is a building demolition. And you notice how the sides are caved in? That's an implosion, okay? So no planes hit it, only small fires, totally collapsed at 5:25. Happened to house the offices of the Security and Exchange Commission, which later said, gee, we lost all those prosecution records for World.com and Enron. Oh, terrible, terrible. And, let's skim on through some of this because you can go on and on. Here is the Windsor Hotel in Spain. It caught fire, burned out of control for 2 days. Out of control for 2 whole days. It didn't fall down. Steel structured buildings do not collapse on their own and because of fire. And again, we see the explosive nature of everything. We see the North Tower has just been struck and it is billowing smoke. But when you look up close, it's so intense it melted the airplane and everybody in it. And here you can see people standing there in the gash. And then we have the South Tower hit. Russ Wittenberg, he flew 100 combat missions in Vietnam and has piloted both American and United jumbo jets, and he said that both of them exceeded their design limitations. Okay, now this gets important because airplanes have what essentially, they're run by a computer, and the computers are programmed so that they cannot do certain things. You cannot make a climb greater than certain degrees. You can't dive greater than certain degrees. You can't make a turn because of the safety and the comfort of the passengers. And what we have here is they were exceeding their design limitations. There's only one way you could do that, and that is to override the computer and be controlling it from somewhere else. And this is exactly what happened. We now know about Global Hawk and how that they can take over planes and fly them remotely. In fact, in the summer of 2001, a Boeing 737 took off from Andrews Air Force Base, and not Andrews, what's the one out here in California? Edwards, thank you. Edwards Air Force Base, flew to Australia, flew 12 missions, and came back, landed safely at Edwards, and all the time there was nobody on board. So they had this technology in 2001, but we didn't know about it.
Quick question about the flight data recorders. I have completely opposing information. They were recovered, they weren't recovered. What do you
There's some question about all that, but I know they did recover the flight recorder for Flight 77 at the Pentagon. And the interesting thing there is we're told that Honey Hanjor, the hijacker, had made this incredible spiraling diving curve, leveled out, and then went right into the bottom floor of the Pentagon. And yet the flight data recorder, according to pilots for 9/11 Truth, said that it showed that the flight deck door had never been opened during flight. So how did he get in there? The whole thing stinks from high to heaven. I mean, good, bad, and everything. These are not just discrepancies and details. I'm an old police reporter, and I've covered all kinds of murders and wrecks and everything else. And yes, there's always a few questions. There's always a few things that never quite add up, but this thing is just one after another. The E-4B, okay? This is the Flying Command Center. One of these is in the air at all times. In case there's a nuclear strike, they're up in the air, they'll survive, and they can launch, the counter strike. They have the electronic capability of taking control over these aircraft. And there was an E-4B sighted over Washington at the time of the Pentagon strike, and another one sighted over Manhattan. And for whatever worth it is, any of you all know about remote viewing, you'll know that I got one of the best remote viewers to take a look at 9/11, and my question to him was, and of course he didn't know the question, he just had a number. But my question was, who's at the controls, or who controlled the planes that flew into the World Trade Center? And the bottom line was, he came up, he said it was being controlled by another plane, the E-4B. Now, once you understand this, this kind of gives us an idea of probably what happened to the Malaysian Flight 360. Well, they dumped them over the Ukraine. That's a good question. Now, I can't tell you because I can tell you what didn't happen, but I can't tell you precisely what happened. But like on Flight 77, well, for one thing, if you read my book, you'll find there's some evidence to show that a similar flight landed in Cleveland that morning, and the city mayor said, you know, we have a flight, we think there's a bomb on board, blah, 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 and then it just kind of disappeared. And then also you have to go back to Operation Northwoods. Northwoods was a plan approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in 1962, and basically it was they're going to bomb American cities, set off bombs, they're going to assassinate selected American cities, they're going to hijack planes, hijack ships, blame it all on Castro. And one of these plans was to take a commercial airliner and ground it, and then take a similar aircraft, paint it up like it's the commercial airliner, fly it out over the Caribbean by remote control, and then by remote control set off a recording saying, help, help, mayday, mayday, we're being attacked by Castro's MiGs, and then by remote control blew up the aircraft and blame it all on Castro. Now, this was a plan that was proposed and accepted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Northwoods. It was only canceled by John Kennedy, who said, we don't play that kind of game. So I think they resurrected Northwoods and spiced it up a little bit for 9/11. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Yes, and that again, the gold seems to play a role in all of this. So there's a picture of the E-4B being taken. Was captured by the mainstream news media over the Pentagon. Again, just more details, but you can see here on Flight 175, they just kind of grazed the tower. So, you know, and yet that was the one that came down first. It burned less time. And yet, because of all this, all that fuel burned off in the midair. You know, what brought down the building. And there's all kinds of things. Mike Perrotto was in the basement, heard an explosion, was knocked down. I think I can tell you, William Rodriguez and other ones, the explosion's deep in the basement. Okay, so here's what I think happened. You got a shaped charge, possibly nuclear, and it blows out all those columns. And then you've got thermite charges, and they're set off, and then since the columns, all the support's gone, then they pancake down, exactly as we've seen. Yeah, okay, let's keep going here. But now this is kind of interesting. This is a picture taken, and you can see the two World Trade Center towers are still there, and yet this building 6 is all burned and scorched. So, and that's the one that there was a huge hole in the ceiling, and it's like, what caused that? They never quite tell us about that. So you can see these gaping holes there, and also this is a thermal thing that shows that a month or so afterwards, there's still these heated areas. This again indicates thermonuclear activity. Now, some of you older guys may remember that back in the 50s, we were shown newsreels of them firing atomic cannons. Had a big long cannon and it fired an atomic shell. About 10 miles, and then the mushroom cloud goes up. So they had an artillery shell back in the 50s, probably about that big, that was nuclear. So don't laugh when somebody tells you by now they've got little nuclear devices about the size of a softball or a basketball. And you use those as shaped charges. But again, this is exotic technology that we're not generally known about. There you are, John. Oh, thanks. Hello. Here you can see some of the girders that have been sliced through that gives evidence that thermite was used. But if that's not good enough for you, then also look at this. What scorched all these cars that were blocks away? I thought buildings just fell down. That didn't cause cars to scorch. And see, they get scorched on one side, and then the back side seems to be okay. And then we have this film that shows these girders sticking up, and they don't fall down, they just disintegrate. Go apart in midair. It's dustified. Here's some parking meters that were scorched and bent over, and they were blocks away. How does a collapsing building do that? Notice the similarity between an atomic bomb test in the desert and the pyroclastic cloud of the World Trade Center. That was World Trade Center number 8. All right. Stick with me. This is boring, but it's important. At the basis, 9/11 was an insurance scam. 2 months before the attacks in the summer of 2001, they had a real dilemma on their hands because the World Trade Center belonged to the Port Authority of New York. And but they were 30 years old. They never were liked. People called them the David and the Nelson because they were built on Rockefeller land, so it gives you some idea of who's involved in all of this. They thought that the 2 big towers broke up their beautiful skyline, and they were never profitable. They never filled them up, okay? In fact, I think it was the South Tower, perhaps, that, was like maybe half empty, all right? Plus, they were 30 years old, and they were deteriorating. And there was a secret study done to see if they couldn't renovate them. But can you imagine what it would cost to put scaffolding up 110 stories? And they finally came to the conclusion that it just was not financially feasible to try to restore those towers. Well, then, okay, let's just tear them down. Wait a minute, City of New York says, no, you can't tear down those buildings because back in the 60s when they were built, they're half full of asbestos. And we're not going to allow you to tear them down and then have asbestos spreading all over Manhattan. Okay, so now I ask you, what does the mafia do if they got a building and they can't renovate it and they can't tear it down? They torch it for the insurance. So 2 months before 9/11, Larry Silverstein Properties, and he's just a front guy, he takes a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center and for a $3.2 billion lease, but the best I could find is the most he ever put up was $125 million. Sounds like a lot to us, but that's not much for a $3.2 billion lease. And I'm not sure, I forget now if that was a down payment or maybe his first payment on this 99-year lease. Then the next thing he does immediately is goes and hires a company called Securicom, which is an Israeli-connected company to provide security for the World Trade Center. Sitting on the board of Securicom is Marvin Bush, George W. Bush's younger brother, and the CEO of Securicom is Wirt Walker III, as in George Herbert Walker Bush. So the Bush family now has control over the security of the World Trade Center. And over the next month or two, on weekends, I've heard from several people that they shut down the towers, turned off the electricity, elevators were stopped because they were doing renovation work. Bringing in what? Planting what? Yeah, exactly. And the next thing Silverstein does is go get insurance on these buildings asked for, demanded, and received a codicil that says, yes, we'll pay off if there's a terrorist attack. Now, I ask you to go see if you can get terrorist insurance on your home. No, but he got it. Now, another thing, important thing to remember is he didn't get this insurance from State Farm. No, he went to Alliance, the giant Nazi Germany insurance company that had indemnified the concentration camps against damage from their inmates during the Nazi years. He also was working with Swiss Re and another Swiss insurance firm. So now these are top-of-the-line global insurance companies headed by Bilderberg members, okay? That's the level that this took place at, and this is why you're never going to hear the full truth of all of this. That's right. It was all a deal, okay? So now he's got his insurance, and then sure enough, 9/11 happens. Here comes the two planes. Well, Silverstein goes to court and says, well, two planes hit two buildings. I want double indemnity. I think he was after, I forget now, he was after $14 billion or something like that. So they argued through the courts for a few months, and finally they ended up, and they paid him $4.6 billion for those buildings, and of which he had only put up $125 million. Not a bad return on your investment. And they got rid of the bad old buildings that they couldn't do anything else with. Plus, look at all the other benefits. They got to launch the war on terrorism. They got to send troops off and go fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they got to curtail our liberties. Set up the TSA, for God's sakes. I always look them in the eye while they're trying to grope me and make me take off my shoes. And I say, why aren't you doing this down on the southern border? And they always go, well, they haven't got an answer. You know, why aren't they doing that on the border? But
It was the biggest heist in history.
Yes.
Biggest heist in history.
You're talking about the gold? Yeah, the gold. There's a lot of gold that was there that got trucked out. That's another thing. Say, huh? Yeah. Now, just go Google missing gold Trade Center. Anything like the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, when you get something of that magnitude, if you'll really dig into it, you usually find it's never just one cause. It's a confluence of causes. All right, well, let's keep going. Quickly, we'll look at the Pentagon. What we told happened there didn't happen there. Here's the one. Now, this is the picture you hardly ever see. Let me jump forward one or two. Wait a minute, I'm going the wrong way. All right, this is the shot. This is the shot that you usually remember seeing about the Pentagon, and that's easy enough to look at that and say, "Oh, gee, an airplane hit it and knocked a hole in the wall." But here is an actual photograph taken before the wall collapsed. And what you're looking at here is a hole that's only 1 story high, so it's only about 12 feet high. And it's only about 20 feet wide. And yeah, there's some damage, you know, obviously something happened here. You got this car that's kind of on fire, and yet this side, the white paint's still okay. The window's still intact here, and these windows are okay. The wall hadn't collapsed. It's just this one little area, just this little hole right here. So I ask you, how do you get a plane with a 125-foot wingspan, 44-foot high tail into a 12 by 20 hole? And the key thing is, again, going back to airplanes, aircrafts are just aluminum stretched around a frame, okay? The heaviest thing on the aircraft would be those 2 jumbo jets that have titanium steel blades and weigh 2 tons each. So picture this, you got the wall of the Pentagon, here comes the plane, you got these 2-ton engines. What's gonna happen? I guarantee you the most probable thing is that they hit the wall and the engines are gonna drop off and they'll be laying there on the ground in front of the building. But, okay, all right, let's argue and say that you got a lot of momentum going, and then what's going to happen? They're going to punch 2 big round holes as they go into the wall. But we don't see any of this. This is what a plane crash looks like, and I know because I've covered enough of them. And here, where's the plane? Where's the wreckage? We see some smoke, and we see some flame, and we see some stuff there, but not much. And now we got this picture, which was taken by one of the fire departments that happened to be out on a call and responded immediately and got there. And early on, they had to change their story because initially the word was that the plane had hit the ground and ricocheted on into the building. Well, then these pictures started appearing on the internet, and you can obviously see the grass is green. Nothing hit that grass. So they had to change the story and say, well, he just went straight into the building, you know. But again, where are the engines? And where are the people? And I know, they don't have the landing gear or the engines because it all burned up, but they did get fingerprints. They think we're idiots. I was grabbing stuff off the internet that day, and they were posting stuff, and a lot of that went down, okay? Now here, this tells the story. The day after Pearl Harbor, Congress convened a panel to investigate what had happened. Less than a week after the Kennedy assassination, Johnson had created his cruddy Warren Commission, but at least they were going to investigate. 2 years after the worst attack by terrorism in United States history, we still had no investigation as to what had happened, but finally, pressure from the families of victims finally forced George W. Bush belatedly to go ahead and form a 9/11 commission, and he funded it for $3 million. $3 million? Now, to us, that's a lot of money, but I guarantee you, in Washington, that's pocket change. Okay, and even the 9/11 Commission said, we can't do anything for $3 million. So he finally kicked it up some more, and by the time they were finished, it had cost the taxpayers $13 million. Okay, well now, wow, let's see what kind of investigation we got. In 2004, the Republican National Committee announced they had spent $60 million on Bush's inaugural parties. 3 times more than they'd spent on investigating 9/11. 4 times, thank you. If I could do math, I'd be in banking. And the whole 9/11 Commission report was just full of 115 significant omissions, including how did they explain the collapse of Building 7? They didn't. They didn't even mention it. How's that for an investigation? There's some of the other omissions. It was total fraud, waste of money. And we now know that they had military exercises going on at the very time. I talked to a Sergeant Chavez who said that prior to 9/11, Cheney had taken charge of NORAD, that the Central Command was involved in drills on 9/11, and that one of the drills at least involved hijacked planes striking the World Trade Center. Why? The games, and the first time in his experience, and he had been in the military about 26 years at that point, he said for the first time in his experience, these war games were classified. And he said that they had inputs, false images, placed on the radar screens indicating hijacked airplanes. This created the confusion because when they contacted NORAD and said, you got any interceptors in the air, the first question was, is this the exercise of the real world? They got the whole thing confused. This is an inside job. Who could do that? Bin Laden did that? I don't think so. And then we've got we find the NSA had intercepted a message from Muhammad Atta on the 10th saying the match is about to begin. Tomorrow is 0 hour. So, number one, he didn't call it the battle or the strike or the jihad. He called it the match, the games. The war game exercises start tomorrow. That's our 0 hour. And how does he know that? Inside job. And you can know this now by reading my book. But this all goes back to this exotic technology to the Iraqi National Museum. I have the stories in my newspaper files from the Associated Press and other stories from 1999, 2000, where German and French archaeological teams are making amazing new discoveries in Iraq, and including weapons. Weapons? Wait a minute. What are we talking about? A rusty old sword, or a spear? I don't think so. And where would they take these new amazing discoveries? To the Iraqi National Museum in Baghdad. And since that's new, they probably had them in the basement before they could be cataloged and presented. And all of human history was residing in Baghdad's museum. And they're finding all kinds of things. For example, you all may or may not know the story of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian king who said his mother was a human and his father was one of the gods. And he went along with his non-human companion Enkidu to try to locate the ancient gods so they could learn the secret of immortality. Well, everybody thought Gilgamesh, the world's first greatest story, was just myth, a legend, until some German archaeologists found his tomb under the Euphrates River. So all of a sudden, Gilgamesh is not some mythological character. He was a real king. This really happened. And so when he's saying that, he was part of the Anunnaki, maybe he was.
Wasn't that being excavated during the Bush?
Yes. Yes, exactly. And that's why they knew all about it. They were aware of all this. We weren't, unless you were keeping up with some of the scientific stuff. Now, we're told by the mainstream media that Saddam Hussein believed himself to be the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar. So I think it would behoove us to go back and see what Nebuchadnezzar was up to. Well, he was building Babylon, one of the greatest civilizations at that time. And then he built a structure out of gold, and it describes it. But it's come down to us, translated or interpreted as a fiery furnace. Well, it couldn't have been a fiery furnace because people went in and out of it. But they got sick and they died. And so this was using ancient alien technology, but they didn't have total control over it. So all you have to do is read the book of Daniel in the Bible. He goes to Palestine. He gets the 3 Hebrew priests, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, brings them up to Babylon, says, you have access to the ancient knowledge, the Zohar and the Kabbalah, and says, I want you to make this thing work. And they said, no, you're not our God, you're not our king, and you don't believe in our God. We're not going to work for you. He said, well, I'm throwing you in it, and if you don't you either make it work or you'll die. And then, interestingly enough, it doesn't just say they chunked them in it. It says they donned their raiments and their hats and their cloaks. What's that got to do with anything? They're putting on their radiation suits because this fiery furnace was a structure of gold, and gold is one of the best conductors of electromagnetic energy. And I think what they were doing here was creating a energy field, perhaps a wormhole. And so they send the 3 priests in there, and King Nebuchadnezzar says, are they all 3 of them in there? And they said, yes, O king. And said, there's a 4th in there. A 4th? Where'd he come from? Who's that? He asked. And in the Bible it says, a son of God. And that's all we hear. Where'd he come from? Who was this? They had very, very exotic technology. And this is what we were after by looting the Baghdad Museum. Because in April 2003, we violated standard military tactics, which is to send the strongest part of your force against the weakest part of the enemy, go in and seize an objective, and then consolidate your winnings, hold all that area, and then move on to the next objective. That's the way wars are won. And we didn't do that. We crashed across the border and we made a beeline for Baghdad, and we never subdued the countryside, which is still causing us trouble. And what happened in Baghdad? They looted the Baghdad National Museum. Who did it? I found out this weekend. Here at this conference was a former colonel who was in charge of transportation in Baghdad, in Iraq at that time, and he informed me that it was a Delta team that went in there because he facilitated getting them in, getting them out. And he said they got stuff. He doesn't know exactly what they got, but they got enough stuff to fill up a transport plane, and they got it out of there. And then they let the mob in, had a mob, and let them go in there and run around and loot the place, see, as a cover story. And here is 170,000 items looted. Although the bulk of those, I understand, have now largely been returned because these were just looters and they'd grab stuff, and then, 2 days later it shows up at the flea market. So they were able to get some of that back. See, just trashed the place. But interestingly enough, they were able to get troops over there to guard the oil ministry. In fact, I remember reading that, obviously, you see in the military, there's no line that says, there are always 2% that don't get the word. Okay, so this thing was all planned out, but somebody didn't get the word because when this looting started, they actually got an American tank and some troops up there, and they started to break the whole thing up. But then they got orders to pull back. Even though prior to our invasion of Iraq, various directors of museums from around the world had pleaded with the Pentagon that, all of human history is in the Baghdad National Museum. Please protect this, and they had been assured that it would be protected. What happens, we send the Delta team in to destroy it and grab the good stuff. Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, Deputy Director of the Joint Interagency Coordination Group, investigated the looting for General Tommy Franks, and he said, basement is an inside job. And I'll say it like a mantra. It is inconceivable that the basement was breached and the items stolen without an intimate knowledge of the museum. And from there, about 10,000 pieces were taken, and we've only recovered about 650. Okay? Now, here's the tip-off. If this was just looting, it'd be looting. They'd grab everything they could, right? The people went towards the basement. They bypassed expensive fakes. Just left them there because they knew they were fakes. They had keys to some of the vaults. Some of the guards were suspiciously missing, called in sick that day or whatever, okay? And they found a pair of glass cutters that are not commercially available in Iraq. So this was a very organized looting, and they were after ancient alien weapons of mass destruction. So we're getting our future technology from the past. And you can see how it starts with Mesopotamia, Ur, goes to Egypt, goes to the Greeks, goes to the Romans, goes north into the Khazarian Empire, in through Eastern Europe, ends up with the Celts, the Scots, the Merovingians. This is the flow of the ancient knowledge. And here we can see how it's all come down, who's gotten their share of it. And of course it's degraded all the way it comes down. So we know some stuff, we don't know some stuff. But the people in charge, they want to keep control over all of this. And part of this is through lack of vision. Somebody should have told him that on the next photo op he needs to take the lens caps off of his binoculars. No. And then, of course, this is they're still trying to push through this superhighway that's going to bring Chinese cargo ships into Mexico, where there's very little control and supervision, and then put them on Mexican trucks and then truck them right up through the United States. This is part of the North American Union that they're working on. So, get back here. who's attempting to rule us through secrecy and deceit. And as I look at it, assuming that Sitchin, these ancient tablets, and all these people who talk about the Anunnaki and ancient aliens, assuming that there's some reality there, what happened to the Anunnaki? As I see it, there's only one of two possibilities. They either all left, or at least some of them are still around. How do we figure out which is which? Well, to me, it's pretty simple. We look at the historical record closely, because if the historical record is, as we are taught, just a slow evolutionary climb from hunter-gatherers to cave dwellers, and then city-states, and then empires, then everything ought to be just kind of rock on along. But that's not what we find. We find UFOs, and we find crop circles, and we find, this is all through history. We see this. So, to me, that means that the ruling elite are trying to contact our ancient creators, or two, they have already contacted the ancient creators and are being guided or controlled by them. Or, number three, they are the ancient creators, the Anunnaki, the serpent kings of old. But right now, we've got to try to restore freedom and integrity to this country. But we do this by knowledge and by knowing what's going on, who's been running us, and so that we quit being whipped from pillar to post by a control media, and we start standing up. And I hate to quote, who was it, Nancy Reagan, but just say no. Thank y'all. All right, we got any questions? Not the exact same one, but there was some overlaps. When did this happen? Right. Yeah, that's true. Sorry. Okay. Okay, well, she went into some detail about her experiences with relatives that were at 9/11 and what she herself has seen. And basically, she doesn't know what it is. I don't know what it is either, but it's obvious that there's stuff going on, that we're not being told about. For one thing, again, let me reiterate on 9/11. There are so many questions, and for one thing, they get people arguing over, was it thermite, was it nanothermite, was it a nuclear device, was it some kind of beam weapon, and who says it has to be one or the other? Why not use all of them? And if you use exotic technology that's not known to the public, then you can put up any cover story you want to, and nobody can easily refute you. Yeah. She thought it was a nuke in the basement.
One of the things that brought up about that especially is that
They couldn't demolish those buildings. They couldn't bring them down in a typical controlled demolition,
no.
because that area in which the buildings was built was actually a sink that was taken from the river. And it was heavily reinforced, but the crashing of the building would have ruptured that and would have flooded it into New York. So it was a very clever way they did it. Combined demolition with dissolving the building. It was pretty well thought out.
Would have dissolved it. And,
Yeah.
There's no way the fuel and
Well, if y'all want to look at, go look at Judy Wood's website, and she will give you some pretty good information about how some sort of beam weapon was used to disintegrate the steel in the buildings, and I tend to agree with her.
Well, then what about the concrete? How does that just evaporate into the, you said that there was only
it's
two.
vaporized. It's vaporized.
Is it vaporized?
Yes, by the pressure from a nuclear weapon.
Wow.
On another whole level, what I found fascinating was that the president sat with the kids for 45 minutes reading a story
About a
after
goat.
hearing this.
Yeah.
I'm like, are you kidding me? And then there was supposedly footage, because he's this brilliant guy, that he walked out after 45 minutes like, well, kids, better go take care of this now.
Yeah.
And he walked out and actually said, oh, well, this was just terrible with the first, and then when the second one was hit, and it was like, cut, it hadn't hit the
Right.
second one yet.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Twice, not once, but twice, Bush said he saw the first plane hit the building. And he thought to himself, I'm a pilot. Man, that's a really bad pilot. Da-da-da-da-da. And of course, we all know that nobody saw the plane hit the building the first time, because supposedly nobody was expecting that. And yet he never rebuked that. He never said no. So how did he know that? And did he actually watch something? He may have. He might have had closed circuit TV, and he's watching the thing unfold. And this old idea about he sits there and reads a little book to the kindergarten kids for 20, 30 minutes because he said he didn't want to upset the kids. Well, I can see that, but wait a minute. What would it take to stand up and say, kids, excuse me, got a little presidential business to take care of?
Away in his brother's state.
Yeah. Well, I think they got Bush out of Washington down to Florida because they didn't want him on the scene. He might screw something up.
I don't think you covered the incident in Pennsylvania plane where it was I think it was shot down. I was on my way to work that day, and I clearly heard them say that fighter jets had been scrambled and that they had shot the plane down. I just wanted to know. I see you didn't mention that in here, and I just wonder what your take on that
is. There's
is.
so much aspect to all this, but yes, I have a word from military people that Cheney gave the order to shoot down the plane. It was shot down by an air-to-air missile. Yes. But we don't want to say we shot down our own plane, even though I think anybody with any sense would say, well, it's hijacked, it's going somewhere, it might kill people, shoot it down, But no, instead of appealing to our sanity and consideration, they got to give us a heroic story. Let's roll.
Certainly could not have gone into that hole at Shanks.
No. In fact, the clincher on that is, like I said, I've covered plane crashes, and they're a mess. And when I see that scene there at Shanksville, there's just a hole and a few pieces that probably big enough to people to pick up and carry off. And the key thing is I understand, if you go back to Google, I don't know if it's still there or not, but go back prior to 9/11, the hole's still there. The crater was there before 9/11. Yeah. So they just came out there and threw a little gasoline around maybe and threw some pieces out and said, yeah. And then I'm also very much aware of the coroner there in Pennsylvania who went out to try to do his job, and he was quoted that day. He said, I couldn't do my job. There wasn't any bodies.
A few days or weeks, it wasn't very long after the buildings fell down, that Cheney went ahead and said, here is this Homeland Security Act. It's a sheaf of papers that's maybe 2-3 inches thick, and they wrote that in 2 or 3 days. No way.
No way.
And what happened to the 3,000 people that were supposedly trapped in those buildings? And if you average out, they maybe weighed 150 pounds apiece, where are those tons of meat? Where are they?
Vaporized. But speaking of, consider this. I told you how the Nazis survived and came on over here. Look at Germany in the beginning of 1933. They were a democratic republic, the Weimar Republic. And Hitler was chancellor, which is kind of like our vice president. Hindenburg was president. And then about a month into 33 in January, towards the end of January, their parliament building, the Reichstag, caught fire and was gutted. Now, to us, a burning building's no big deal today after what we've experienced, but I want to tell you, in those 1930s, to those cultured Germans, that was as big a shock and disaster as 9/11 was to us. So then Hitler says, the communist terrorists did this. You got to give me the power to respond to this. So they rushed through the Enabling Act. And the Enabling Act consolidated the German police departments under fatherland security and set up concentration camps for dissidents to protect the people, gun registration, and followed by confiscation. And it all worked then. Why not do it again? 9/11, the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the creation of Homeland Security,
And DAA.
Homeland Security. I mean, they don't even change the term that much. They just reinstitute it, and we're just going, yeah, well, it got to protect us from the terrorists. Yeah, sure.
Jim, did you ever consider that maybe Flight 93 that went down in Pennsylvania was destined for Building 7 in New York? It seemed like they needed to have some other provocation for it,
Yeah.
but when they didn't have that and they had nothing else to
What
do,
can they do?
they pulled the trigger on it.
Yeah.
Also, real quick, what about the dancing Mossad agents that had their camera equipment set up in New Jersey and were dancing as the planes hit? They were all prepared to record this, which they admitted they were there to record the event. But how the hell did they know the event was going to happen?
There is obvious to me an Israeli connection to all of this. The Securicom, okay, that the Bushes were mixed up with, was an Israeli company. The oil deals, they're all interconnected. When I was in Israel, I asked them about the 7 Days War and blah, blah, blah. And it turns out that despite all these wars over in Israel, the pipelines keep flowing. It's all business. You don't mess with business. That's another thing that always bothered me about Pearl Harbor. When I visited Pearl Harbor, here was the harbor, and here were all these battleships lined up. But right up here on this big hill were these huge petroleum tanks, tank farms up here, you know? And I've always thought, well, you know, hitting those obsolete battleships, that was okay, but I would have dropped at least one bomb on the fuel supply, and then it doesn't matter what we had at the Pacific Fleet, we couldn't go anywhere, okay? But no, the oil supply never got hit. And also the fact that within 2 or 3 days before Pearl Harbor, there were at least 3 aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor. And anybody knew anything knew that we needed aircraft carriers to fight World War II in the Pacific. And when the Japs came over to bomb Pearl Harbor, those aircraft carriers were all off and gone somewhere, you know. It's all a deal. And I guess this goes back to when I was a kid and my uncles all fought in World War II, and my dad. And one of my uncles told me, he was a forward observer, Patton's Third Army, and he was telling me that he was driving his Jeep around in the outskirts of Berlin. And I said, no, wait a minute. I said, you know, we were told the Russians took Berlin. He said, well, they did. He said, we were there, but we got orders to pull back 100 miles and then just sit there and wait for the Russians to come and take the city. And he said, meanwhile, the Germans were giving up en masse to us. They wanted to give up the Americans. Whole divisions were giving up. And yet the Russians are having to fight tooth and toenail for every city block going into Berlin. Hey, it's just there's deals. See, we watch TV and we care about our families and we go to church and, you know, we're just taxpayers. You know, we're not let in on how all this actually works.
I have the mic over here. I heard an airline flight instructor, crash inspector, talk about the plane that flew into the Pentagon. And he said, well, or whatever it was that flew into it, had to be a missile because it hit 2 light posts going through. Were knocked down. And that you can't fly a 747 on a big jet like that because of ground effect that close to the ground.
That's what I think too.
To be lift up, you'd have to fly at 100 feet to fly at 600 miles per hour.
Exactly. What he's talking about the ground effect on the Flight 77 into the Pentagon. You saw the picture of the hole. The hole's at ground level. You can't get a plane. It's impossible to get a plane at that speed, at that level, because you're pushing an envelope of air in front of you, and you can't do it. It would bounce you back. You know, the whole thing is just so full of anomalies. And
It's so phenomenally stupid.
so outrageous. It's so in your face.
How could you possibly believe that? Nothing works out. Nothing.
Not a thing.
So this whole flight Malaysia 7 something that was missing.
Right.
Like, are they kidding me? They have satellites that can find us anywhere, but they can't find a plane.
Hey, come on, folks. You remember during the Cold War, and we were told that we had these satellites and we had all this sensitive stuff and heat-seeking stuff, and that the Russians could launch a missile from the Ural Mountains, and we'd know about it, and we could track it. But now, years later, they tell us, oh, well, we can't keep up with an airplane. It's insane. It's just nuts. Okay.
What do you think happened with that plane?
The Malaysia plane? Okay, Malaysia 360. Here's my supposition.
Can I ask a question before we change our subject?
Okay.
And we can't all hear each other if we're all talking at the same time, so if we could stay on the mic, because I can't hear you guys up there, that would be great. So 2 points to add is the cancer rate from the towers. The first responder dogs died, the first responders died, a lot of people that were in the dustification that died, and whoever came out and said, oh, the streets are safe, and that level would not be achieved.
Of Health and Human Services.
Yeah.
Said, oh,
The level of that
okay.
cancer rate would not be achieved just by a fire. You'd have to aerosolize the asbestos and have, radiation and all kinds of things to cause that high level of cancer rate. I believe there's a class action lawsuit right now or something going on with a lot of those people that were survivors and their high cancer rate.
Yep.
And then I always found it to be a curiosity, and I would like your opinion. I was actually asleep and got rudely awoken when, my boyfriend at the time was like, oh my God, the towers. And my first thought was, doing the math on the planes. You find out that all the planes were 25% occupancy. Then you find out that the towers were basically vacant. You got the calls that people were told not to come to work. And they hit the towers before the wonders of the world were open. So the death toll in the buildings was as low as possible. Then when they hit the Pentagon, they hit in the area where they were remodeling, so that was also the lowest death numbers possible. So I always found that a curiosity. The planes were as low as possible, the towers were as empty as possible, and you had those different wings. The one investment firm lost all those people, the other people didn't, et cetera, et cetera. And then you could also go into the short selling of the stock and on and on and on. But I'm curious why the casualty count was so low. If it was bin Laden, he'd want to kill as many Americans as possible.
Well, they're evil murderers, but they didn't want to be too bad.
Yeah, I just find that weird,
But you mentioned something, though, that bugged me from the very beginning, which was I was flying a lot in 2000, early 2001. And one of the big scandals going on right then was the fact that the airliners, in their desperate need to try to make more profit, were canceling flights if they couldn't fill them up. Okay? And so, in other words, say they got a plane that holds 250 people and they only had 100 people on it, they'd cancel the flight and tell them to hold off. And then, 4 hours later, you get another flight and then they fill that one up. And so I was well aware of this because I got caught in all that, And so then on 9/11, I see that here's these 4 flights, and one of them, they all carried a couple of hundred passengers, and one of them's got 64 passengers. One of them's got 59 passengers. Why? What is with that? The whole thing stinks to high heaven, and unfortunately, see, we're in a position now to where folks like us, we can ask these questions, but where are our so-called leaders? Where are the people that we voted for to try to ask these same questions and get us legitimate answers? They're not there. So what are you going to do about it? I'll tell you one thing. You got November coming up. Check and find out everybody on your voting list and find out if they're in office. And if they are, vote them out. Send them a little message, okay? And if they're decent, they'll go along with it. I remember Ron Paul, who I still have a high regard for. I wouldn't trust any of them, and I don't trust him 100%. But at least he tells the truth. And he has said, I could put up with being voted out if it means cleaning some house up here. But you got everybody gripes about what's going on in this country, and then they turn around and vote for the same old jerk that got them in that situation. Yeah.
There you go, we need a new party.
That's right.
A new future.
That's right. Wait a minute. Let me back off here. She asked about 360. Let me quickly, I'll tell you about 360.
Yeah.
No, over here.
Mike is here.
370. Okay, 370 had 20 members on it that were all members of Farscale, a company out of San Antonio, Texas that is partially owned by the Rothschilds, partially owned by the Carlyle Group. Okay, so now we got Bush, Kissinger, the usual cast of characters. And some of these people were Chinese citizens that had been working for them, and they had been working on sensitive defense type equipment, as stealth technology perhaps. And according to the contracts, they were partners in the patent process and stood to make a lot of money if all this stuff proves out. But also according to the contracts was if something happened to them, their heirs did not get the rights reverted back to the company. So you got that, you got money involved, and you've got the idea that perhaps Cheney and Bush and these bunch, maybe they decided they didn't want such technology going to China. So on 360, they use the computer capture technology, same thing they'd used so successfully on 9/11. They captured the plane, boom, it goes off radar, it's zooming low, it's seen, heading in another trajectory out over the Indian Ocean, and then just basically disappears. If you knew anything about the guy who sent the email message from his cell phone, he said, "I'm being held captive and they have a hood over my face and I don't know where I am." But the data from his cell phone indicated he was on Diego Garcia, our most secret base in the South Indian Ocean. So, these guys have control over all of that. So they took the 360, they flew it off course, and they flew it. By the way, the pilot may have even been in on it because they found that at his home he had a flight simulator program and had several programs there about landing on Diego Garcia. And that's one of the most secure bases in the world. Nobody gets there unless they take you there. And so if they landed it there and rolled it into a hangar, even the people on Diego Garcia might have known. Fly it in at night, put it in a hangar, nobody even knows it's there. Now, whatever happened to all those people? Well, one of the theories is this Malaysian flight that was shot down over the Ukraine. Some of the first responders there said, well, it's funny, but these bodies were all decomposing. In other words, they were long dead. And you're not going to find that on a plane that just got shot down. So the idea was they took some of these people off that Malaysia 360 flight, packed them onto this 17 flight, shot it down over the Ukraine with the idea of blaming it on Russia. Hey, they're very Machiavellian, man. Nothing's past them. They'd do anything. Yes, ma'am.
How do you relate the war in Ukraine with the pyramids that were the oldest pyramid that was found in that area? That's one. And then I also wanted to know more about the tax laws being not lawful in the U.S., like the Federal Reserve. Can you tell us more about that?
Okay. First off, the pyramid is in Bosnia. So at this point, I don't have any reason to believe that the Bosnian pyramid has anything to do with the events in the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, though, it seems fairly sensible to me as to what's happening. On any political issue, and particularly any politician, you can't listen to what they say because they're going to lie to you. And I don't say that in an accusatory way. I say that as a matter of fact. Nobody can get elected if they tell the truth, okay? Just ask Ron Paul, okay? So they have to lie to you. So you have to watch what they do, okay? When it comes to Russia, I certainly don't want to trust Putin, but I watch what the Russians have been doing. And let's go back a little bit. We had the Cold War. And then communism kind of collapsed. And then they said they had been holding on to Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and blah, blah, Poland. And did we force them out of Eastern Europe? No. They said, okay, communism's collapsed, we're going to try to do better, and we will withdraw military from Eastern Europe if you'll pledge not to expand NATO. And we said, okay. And they voluntarily pulled their troops out of Eastern Europe. Now they held on to Ukraine because Ukraine's always been part of Russia. All right, so they just, everything's status quo. There we are, just pre-World War II Russia. And what did? We started ringing them with NATO bases and putting missiles up all around them. Now who's the bad guys? So now we sent our people into the Ukraine, CIA, to try to start a so-called independence movement. And it would be the same thing as if, say, Mexico sent troops into Texas and said, we're going to regain Texas for Mexico. What is the U.S. going to do? We'd say, no, you can't do that. Well, Russia says, no, you can't do that. And so we get a little fight going. It's all a deal. It's all arranged. It's all part of the plan. Okay.
Right here. I have two questions. First, can you speak to TWA Flight 800? And second, disregarding the totalitarian test in Boston, do you have knowledge of any other false flags as of lately?
Well, you're asking me to forecast now, and I've never claimed to be a prophet.
No, not forecast. Do you have knowledge of any others that maybe aren't mainstream, at least in this crowd?
Oh. No, but let's go with your first question about the TW Flight 800, because that does get into some of the stuff and may play a role even in 9/11. You all are familiar with Judy Woods, Dr. Woods, right? And her work on some kind of beam weapon used on the World Trade Center towers, which could explain the disintegration of the concrete and steel and everything else. Okay, now where I differ with her is she seems to think that must have come from a satellite in space, and I think it's closer to home. I have reason to believe that back in the late 80s, they were working on a particle beam weapon at Brookhaven National Laboratory that sits in the middle of Long Island. In the late 80s, about 89, they knocked down a UFO using this beam weapon. And it crashed in Mauritius Bay, and there was a little bit of a blurb about it, and you may vaguely recall the story, and I can't remember his name now, John Ford, I think was his name, up in that area, who kept saying, this is a UFO, and they got a UFO, and the next thing you know, they grab him and accuse him of being a child molester or something and pack him off to the funny farm because he's talking too much about this stuff. But he wasn't the only one. In fact, I have an interview with my friend Leonard Stringfield, who now passed away, who interviewed one of the scientists at Brookhaven who were working on this particle beam accelerator, okay? And then in '92, they used it again to knock down a UFO. And this UFO crashed in South Haven Park, there right close to Brookhaven, and started a big fire. Well, then we jump on up to, when was TW-800? 96? I think 96. Anyway, the time of the TW-800. And we were trying to figure out what the heck's going on with that. And at that time, I was working with some of the military remote viewers, and so I was contacted by Christine Borgerson, who was a producer for CBS, and she was wanting to come through me to try to reach some of these Army remote viewing guys to find out what they could tell us about the TW-800. And so I began to work with her, and we even went up there. We went up and went to Montauk and then came down, and we were heading back to New York one evening, and I saw the sign that said South Haven Park, and I remembered the story about the UFO coming down in South Haven Park. So I said, hey, pull in here. So we pulled in, and there was like a little guard station and one car sitting out in front. So I went in there, and sure enough, here's a park ranger. And I certainly didn't want to just act like an idiot and say, tell me about the UFO. So I just given him my good old boy Texan talk and saying, yeah, I was up here visiting, and I said, y'all had a big fire back here in '92, didn't you? And he kind of looks at me, and I said, yeah. I says, I said, did they ever figure out what caused that? And he looked at me real hard. He says, you want to know about the UFO, don't you? And I'm going, well, yeah. You know, I said, do you know anything about that? And he said, I was on duty that night. I said, well, great. Tell me all about it. He said, I can't. He said, I'll lose my job. He said, but my buddy was on with me, and he's not working here anymore. I said, well, would he talk to me? He goes, I don't know. He said, but I'll check. Nice guy. So he goes over in the next room. I see him on the telephone. He's talking, you know. And he comes back and goes, no, I'm sorry. He didn't want to talk about it. And now that's just that one little thing. I met a lot of other people up there who, by indication, implication, you know, this happened, okay? So they're using this particle beam weapon to knock down these UFOs. Now, the TW-800 went down 65 miles southeast of Long Island in an area designated Tango Billy. It was a military exercise area. And they had the missile launching ship, the Normandy, was on station, also a submarine and some other craft. And the test apparently was to something they've been working on for years and years, trying to stop a missile in flight. Can you, here comes a missile, can you stop it? It's not an easy proposition. And so they were going to test this particle beam weapon. And so everybody connected to that incident told the truth. They said, people said we saw a missile go up, it did. People said we saw a wavy light in the sky, they did. They said there was an unidentified aircraft up there, there was, okay? And then of course the government says, well, a spark got in the central fuel tank and blew the plane apart. They told the truth. They just didn't quite explain how a spark got in the fuel tank. So what happened was the TW-800 was an hour late taking off. They were supposed to have already been off and gone out of the scene by 8 o'clock at night when they activated this military exercise area. But they had some kind of little mechanical problem or something, and they were late. They were after 8:30 before they were taking off. And as they climbed, running parallel to Long Island, they fired off this particle beam weapon aimed at a drone aircraft that was being shot at by this missile. And the idea was to see if they could stop the missile. Now, the missile may or may not have hit the TW-800, but even if it had, that might not have been enough to actually destroy the aircraft. But what happened was the beam weapon hit it, it fried the onboard computer, and all the valves are opening, closing, and shutting, and jumping all around, sparking, you know, and a spark got in the central fuel tank and blew it up, and the thing went down. So everybody was telling the truth, except they can't reveal their secret weapons testing. Okay? Now, if that is the case, and they use this beam weapon to hit a target 65 miles away, if you just turn further to the south, you're only 25 miles from the World Trade Center. So all they could do is aim it at that thing, and they could bring that whole building down, disintegrate it by just, knocking everything apart.
Jim, at the time of that occurred, I was subscribing to a magazine called Media Bypass.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember it?
Yeah.
And there was an article on that flight, TW-800. You might want to try to find this. I don't have the magazine anymore. The reportage was that there was a woman on board that plane who was taking all the whitewater information to London to give it to the Guardian newspaper because that would have put Clinton in total jeopardy. And that was not going to happen.
Okay, if y'all missed that, he said there was an article that said a woman on the TW-800 was taking whitewater documents showing the corruption and the crimes of the Clinton family over to England for publication. Now, if that's true or not, I don't know, but it certainly fits in with what I said earlier, which is when these things happen, there's usually a multiplicity of agendas. It's not just this one little thing. The end story of TW-800 is that, so once we figured out what had actually happened, Christine Borgensen, who had been assigned by CBS to find out what happened to the airplane, went back, reported, said, here's what happened, and they said, oh, well, you're fired.
The amazing thing is you have this plane go down, and they spent how many millions of dollars to dig every piece up out of the ocean? put it back together, and try to prove what was it. But at 9/11, nothing.
That is a very, very key point, and I've used this over and over. And you folks, you may be a little bit puzzled and confused about avionics, and all the technical aspect. But just think about this: every time there's a plane crash, they pick up every piece they can find. They take it to a big hangar and they try to put it back together as best they can to determine what happened. Okay, you show me that aircraft that they've put together in a hangar somewhere, and the FBI claims they've done this, but you find me a picture of that and I will shut up about the Pentagon. But we've never seen that, and you're not, because no airplane hit the Pentagon.
The other,
Okay.
Can you verify that they've just passed a law that the banks can raid your bank accounts for up to 20% at their whim?
Raise?
No, raid.
Raid?
Yeah, take your money out.
Steal your money.
That's right.
Yeah,
Is that true?
No, I cannot, I'm not that conversant right now. I can't say for sure that they've actually done that, but I will say I know for certain they're planning that, and they have done that. For instance, in Cyprus, okay, they just suddenly call a bank holiday and say any amount over a certain amount, you don't get, or you can only withdraw $200 for a week or so, and all this stuff's in the works. So I'm telling you right now, if you're smart, I've had several people here ask me, well, what do I do about all my money? And I'm going to leave you with two words: tangible assets. Okay, silver, gold, artwork, jewelry, firearms. There's never been a quality firearm made in the history of the world that's done anything but appreciate and value. Okay, plus if everything goes to shit, you got a gun.
quick question about the photographic evidence. The only pictures I've ever seen of the hijackers were them on a plane from, I think it was Maine to Boston, and nothing in New York. And I don't know how they explain the fact that there was absolutely no photographs of them at any New York airport or Washington airport. And then the other photographic evidence is the Pentagon must have had hundreds of cameras pointed outward.
More than 80.
More than 80. And the only one we've seen is a parking lot stop
with a fire
motion.
brake.
Yeah.
You can't see that.
Yeah. So
Now, to answer
have
your
you had
question, how do they explain all this? Their explanation is, we're the government, trust us. We're here to help you. Quickly, we got to go here.
Are the Clintons involved in the Bilderbergs?
Oh yeah, of course. In fact, that's why they're pushing Hillary for president. Yeah, because back in the early 90s, Hillary Clinton attended a Bilderberg meeting and was there at the door greeting people as they came in, which is their time-honored way of introducing their people to the members. They're all part of it.
She gets her marching orders from the CFR. That was her quote.
Yeah, exactly. Don't get me started.
Who the hell is he?
Well, you know the difference between Obama and his dog Bo? Bo's got papers.
Obama's got a Connecticut Social Security number.
I know, that's totally phony. His birth certificate has 25 layers on it. It's all phony. He's total phony. And the thing is, they have been masterful at playing the race card on this whole thing. If you try to say anything about Obama, then you're a racist. It is bullshit, because I have nothing against race. And you know who I like to see president is Morgan Freeman. Seriously. He may be a cruddy person, but he's a great president.
I got a question. Has anyone tried to file a Freedom of Information request for the footage around the Pentagon?
About what?
And to release it, to just see it from, like the 80 video cameras.
Yeah, of course.
Well, why can't we get it?
They stonewall them, or they say we don't have anything. It's, I'm in charge here. Classified. It's all classified. Pending investigation. I have really got to get rolling here, but I appreciate it. I really do.
Hey, y'all, let's give a big thank you and a big hand to Jim Mars. He even took some extra time for us. You guys, he's got a table out there with his books. Let's really support him and keep his work moving forward. Also, there are DVDs available of all the workshops. And they're right in front of the sanctuary. And even though these are 3-hour-long DVDs, they're still selling them for just $10. Yep, they're still out there. I just heard they'll be there till midnight. But you want to go make your order now so that you'll have it. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. It's been an amazing contact, you all. Lots of love.